All right, sorry about that. I'm Dr. Jared Jones, research specialties, ancient systems of meditation, the cognitive science of meditation, Buddhist philosophy, and the philosophy of science. This is Buddhist PhD Live, where I subject myself to the horrors of the internet to answer your questions at great personal cost. Kidding aside, I've been a Buddhist for about 21 years and training in Dragon Gate Taoism for another 6. And in addition to this, I've been also training in Zen for some period of time. So my experience is quite wide when it comes to actual Buddhist practice. When it comes to academic credentials, I've been studying for quite some time as an academic as well. So my master's work covered the cognitive science of meditation, and my PhD covered Buddhist philosophy, in particular Minyamaka philosophy. So, if any of these topics are of interest to you, these sessions I just answer audience questions and things evolve as they do. So, feel free to jump in, ask whatever questions you might have, and I'd be happy to answer them as they come in. So, normally, if there are no questions in the beginning, I have a topic in mind, but today I don't have anything in particular on my mind. I've been doing a fair amount of seated practice recently, and it's been interesting because the types of seated practice that how to say, some types of seated practice are very much in work with the mind and the body at the same time. And I've been doing a fair amount of practice that works with the body and the mind simultaneously. In particular, because I've been working with Neil Ripsky to get his 18 Lohan system out there. And well, instead of me droning on about things that I think are interesting, but perhaps not interesting to everyone else, let's take the questions that are now coming in the chat. So, Chroma, good to see you. Mountain License, good to see you. Decided to do a late session today rather than an early one because why not? Okay, Max Enlightened, welcome. All right, so we've got some questions coming in. So for those of you who are tuning in as things develop here, please do just pop your questions in the chat. I do my best to answer them in the order that they come in. And let me just say, for those of you who are streaming through here now or streaming through later, I do everything that I do by donation. So the courses and things that I teach, I have an equivalent of that material also here for free on my YouTube. So everyone has access to what I do completely for free. If you wanted to support these sessions and so forth so that I can carry on doing this for everyone else, then please do put your go down below. You can find the links for Venmo, PayPal. You can also find a couple of different courses I've put together. One of them is just me. The other one is me and Neil Ripsky. Okay, let's take a look at the questions that are coming in. Right. So the first question is, what are my thoughts on Dzogchen? So Dzogchen is a fantastic system coming through the Tibetan lines of practice. Dzogchen is a is coming through the older transmission of Buddhism into Tibet. There were two different transmissions primarily. Sorry, looks like I'm getting a little bit of lag here today. Sorry about that, my friends. Change the position of my computer a bit here. Okay, see if that helps. So Dzogchen is a really phenomenal system. It's meant really to be at the end of a longer process of training. It's not something that comes at the beginning. Um, Dzogchen is, in my understanding of Dzogchen, it's a system wherein you're. I wonder why I'm getting such a bad connection here. Sorry, my friends. Give me one moment. Hmm. Well, it looks like my internet connection is pretty good. Yeah, so if you're here and you're getting a little bit of lag, just go back, let it buffer a bit, and YouTube will catch up because my software is storing all this information. So by the time it hits your side, it will actually be all put together. Okay, so Dzogchen comes from an older transmission, primarily, is my understanding. It comes from primarily the first transmission of Buddhism into Tibet. Very, very old system, very profound system. However, what it relies upon is making the subtlest aspect of your consciousness manifest and obvious, and then abiding in that and using that as the primary aspect in which you're doing, from which and in which you're doing your practices. And that's quite a difficult thing to do, actually. um, I haven't been trained in that system. I've actually been wanting to do some retreat and some study in that system to be better informed and to understand those practices a bit better. But what I have studied from studying the other Tibetan systems that talk about Dzogchen, let's put it that way, uh, is that Dzogchen is a system basically that relies on your ability to generate the subtlest type of mind that there is. You have to be able to generate the very subtlest type of mind that exists in order to do those practices. So if you can't do that, then you can't actually do the practice. So, of course, then Dzogchen and the system like Nyingma and Kagyu Nyingma and I think Sakya has it also, if I'm not mistaken. I think Gelug's the only school that doesn't have it, but I could be wrong. Um, are all then teaching you additional methods to get you mentally, physically, energetically to a place where you can actually generate the subtlest type of mind that there is. Uh, and generate is a bit of a funny word, but to make evident, to make obvious the most subtle type of mind that there is. Yeah. So, yeah, some of what I see out there that's called Dzogchen, it confuses me a little bit because it doesn't seem to be talking about that. And if it's not talking about that, then I don't know what it is. You know, it may just be that there's a bunch of stuff you can do before that, and it's also called Dzogchen. But I don't understand personally, from what I've looked at and studied, I don't understand how a person could do Dzogchen practice unless they could generate the subtlest or make manifest the subtlest type of consciousness that exists as part of our being. So if some of you are getting a little bit of lag, just go to the little slider on YouTube, slide it all the way back to the beginning, and it should already be buffered for that part. And you can start from there, which will be a mess, but I'll trim it up later. Okay, let's see. So we have 7 people in the. Okay, yeah, here we go. So please do, if you're here and you're getting a bit of lag, just go back to the beginning of the stream and start from there. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat now so that I can get to them as I get to stuff in the chat, and eventually you guys will catch up with me. Okay. Max Enlighten asks about Dr. Rob Monk Life Meditation. I don't know a lot about Dr. Rob. I do know that he's not a doctor. I know that much. I don't know that much about his history. I have chatted with him a bit just to sort of see what he's all about. I don't have a strong opinion to relay. So, yeah, my thing is sort of, it's a bit different than what Robert is doing. Um, if you find something interesting there, that's fine with me, I suppose. But not too much to say. I'll leave it at that. Okay. Jamila asks, it feels like there's a large jump in faith between the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path and the most esoteric schools, which feel more mythological. I find it hard to understand. Okay. So I think one of the things that's important to know is that if you study the Pali Canon in detail, you'll find a great deal of what you thought was just Mahayana, weird mythological sounding stuff also there in the Pali Canon. For example, there used to be in the Theravada tradition, broadly conceived, another tradition called Boron, which was an esoteric tradition of Theravada practice. Furthermore, even now, there are schools of Theravada practice that have more of a, seem to have more of an influence, let's say, from some kind of sort of tantric approach to what it is you're doing in terms of training and meditation. And I know of some people who have trained with me who are also training in those systems. And some of what they describe in terms of their main practices sound like stuff that you would do as a tantric practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, for example. The number of tools that are there, let's say, on the side of the number of tools that are there on the side of those practices and so forth, insofar as I've seen, are less. There's a lot less tools. Let's see. There's a lot less tools on the side of those practices coming out of the Pratimoksha systems, but those tools are most certainly there. It's not like they're completely absent. There are aspects of them here and there, and then in terms of the broader mythological sort of feeling, if you read a great deal into the Pali Suttas, you'll find that there are descriptions of things like pure realms and the perceptions of Buddhas and heavenly realms and so forth that sound very much like the descriptions of stuff that you find in the Mahayana canon, again broadly conceived, that are much more grandiose in their scope than simply, let's call it, the really skeletal version of Buddhism that's taught as mainline Theravada stuff in the modern world if you're not a monastic. So a great deal of this stuff that you probably don't think is there is actually there if you were to study in more detail. I don't know if that helps or not. Probably doesn't help that much, but yeah, it's important to know. It's important to know you find this stuff in both places. So in one sutta, for example, there's a person who approaches the Buddha, and I believe, if I might be mixing my stories up because it's been a while since I read the source, but I believe this person was a great logician. They were a great debater. And they had approached the Buddha and said, oh, okay, if the Buddha says this, I'm going to say that. And if he says that, I'm going to say such and such. And I'm going to trap him in a logical trap until he can't get out. And the Buddha, being a clairvoyant being, reads his mind, understands his position fully, and is before, I think either right during or like immediately before or immediately after this guy lodges his position, the Buddha asks him one question and totally destroys the guy's position. and the guy just sits there silently. And the Buddha asks him a second time, and he says, just so you know, if you don't answer a direct question aimed at you by a Buddha, and then this deity appears behind the guy with like a big axe. He says this deity is going to cut your skull in half if you don't answer the question. Right? So you read this sort of thing in the Pali Canon and you go, wow, that kind of sounds like a lot of stuff you find in Mahayana sources. So, yeah, I mean, in so many words, I think one thing you need to understand about the Pali Canon is that it was edited twice according to the Pali Canon. Furthermore, according to the Theravada sources, as far as I understand them, there were a number of Buddhist councils where Buddhists from around the realm, from all over the world, as best they could, they all got together and they had councils to try to figure out what did the Buddha say and what did he not say. Now, what's really interesting about that idea is this. Imagine just for a moment that the Buddha didn't teach the same thing to everyone, which is the claim that the Mahayana has. You find it in the Agamas, you find traces of it in the Pali, because the Buddha teaches 3 vehicles, right? So you find traces of it here and there in the Pali and what have you, and then you find it in the Agamas, certainly find it in the Sanskrit, which then becomes the Tibetan canon. The Tibetan canon is almost entirely straight from the Sanskrit canon, which would have been the high Indian Buddhist canon, directly stemming from the Buddha's instructions in India, the highest institutions of Buddhism in India, where he had been teaching. Teachings recorded in Sanskrit made their way to Tibet, where they were translated into Tibetan. We've lost most of the Sanskrit. We still have the Tibetan. So again, it's kind of an interesting thing to go, oh, well, we can't trust the Tibetan sources. Well, why not? This is like his home turf. These are the teachings that were preserved on the Buddha's home turf, brought to Tibet, translated by royal decree, using translation teams that included both Indian scholars of the time and Tibetan scholars of the time. Why wouldn't we trust those as Buddha's teachings? But I digress. So when you start looking at what kind of stuff is there in the Mahayana sources that's not there in the Pali sources, mainly what you find, if we're ignoring the tantric aspect for a moment, is an emphasis on things like who can attain Buddhahood, right? Who can attain Buddhahood? Exactly what is the nature of Buddhahood? How many different viewpoints and positions did the Buddha teach? Right? There's some different answers there. Furthermore, throughout the course of history of let's call it the high Indian Buddhist tradition, as it was being exported all over the world, part of what happened in that tradition was there were other great yogis and great scholars of the tradition who had experiences that are fully in line with the Buddha's teachings. Nagarjuna says that the Buddha calls himself all over the Pali Canon. He's talking to gods. He talks to Nagas. He talks to, the Buddha talks to all sorts of beings in the Pali Canon. So Nagarjuna said, I met some Nagas and they taught me about the perfection of wisdom sutras, right? The Shakyamuni left teachings with them and they gave them to me. Now, what's really interesting about that claim is that when you read Nagarjuna, his commentaries on the Prajnaparamita really make sense out of Prajnaparamita for the first time in Buddhist history. And we have Prajnaparamita Sutra, one of the Prajnaparamita Sutras is the oldest sutra in Buddhist archaeology. One of the oldest texts we have in the historical record is a Mahayana Prajnaparamita Sutra. So this isn't like something that came later that we need to throw out. As far as we can tell, all of these teachings came at about the same time. They arrived at about the same time. The only potential exception would be the tantric teachings, which one may be forgiven in thinking they might have come up later. But then you have to ask. You have to ask this question. Hey, Levi. How you doing, Belle? So you have to ask this question. If it is the case that the Buddha didn't teach Tantra, as modern practitioners, when we look at something like the techniques found in Tantra, is the relevant question, did the Buddha teach this? Or is the relevant question, does it work? Because the Buddha said, even in the Pali Canon, you will know my teachings when you see that they do a couple of things. One is, you'll see that they match the general corpus of my teachings. roughly speaking. The other one is you'll see that they reduce attachment, aversion, and ignorance. So if something is leading towards the goal that I said is possible, to put it in the broadest possible terms. Hello from Scotland. Hello from India. I'll have to call you number 12. What is that? Ha, pa, ya, ha, ya. You have to tell me. My Sanskrit is rusty, and that's probably Hindi. P, pinya. Yeah. Anyways, so yes. So what you find is that, at least in my investigation of these things, take something like Tumo, which has correlates in China in the form of Neidan practice, which you find amongst Buddhists and Taoists, and this is basically a technique of allowing you to induce a state of concentration extremely quickly, while also making the body healthier, making it easier to sit for long periods of time, making it Taniya. Taniya. Oh, is that? Oh, that's an I from the N. Okay. Tanya. Fair enough. So when you look at techniques like Neidan, Tumo, etc. from Tantra, you find that, well, actually these things are generating really good states of concentration really quickly, making the body healthier, making it easier to sit, making it easier to sit for longer periods of time, blah, blah, blah. Why wouldn't we want to use that as Buddhists? You understand what I mean? I think what makes it so strange for people is that there are so many aspects that they take a long time to figure out why those things are there and what you use them for. Like visualizing an entire 3D environment around you, or visualizing yourself as a deity, seems very strange. Right? Hello, Chevre. So very, very strange indeed to consider all of these aspects. But then when you look at the details of what you're supposed to do in doing all of those things, you find out that all of them are meant to reduce attachment, aversion, and ignorance. That's why they're there. And then if you ask, well, do they work? Well, I know, how do you assess that from where you are, other than using logic and reasoning? Because you can't use it, you can't do it with direct experience from here. So I know this is a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's an interesting question. I think that, in broadly speaking, there's just a lot of there's a lot of esoteric sounding, mythological sounding stuff in Theravada Buddhism. The Buddha was born onto earth from Tushita heaven, according to the Pali Canon. He selected his mother's womb, according to the Pali Canon. He was born out of her side and then took 7 steps and spoke after coming out of her womb immediately and said, I am supreme in this world. So, you know, if we're talking about mythology, there's plenty of mythological sounding stuff in the Pali Canon. We don't have to go to the Mahayana Canon for that sort of thing. The Buddha performs miracles of all kinds, hovers above a river and stops a war, fights using miraculous siddhi powers, and against other great yogis of the time who had siddhi powers, he outmatched them all. You know, all sorts of stuff. He travels to the god realms regularly. Gods regularly come to him and appear in front of him. His students also, according to the canon, go to the heavenly realms and do all sorts of stuff. Hello, Caves. Hello, German. So there's plenty of esoteric mythological sounding stuff in the Pali. The Mahayana, honestly, is not that different. There's certainly difference, but it's a difference, I think, of degree, not a difference of in. I want to be careful in what I'm saying, but it's a difference in sort of the degree of the same elements and how extrapolated they are versus completely different elements, if that makes sense. And then in terms of methods, of course, I think the Mahayana has way more methods there, because Tantra has hundreds of different methods for working with yourself. And then whether or not those methods are in line with the Buddha's teachings is not an easy or straightforward question. But some of the greatest yogis and scholars of India, since the year 300 until about the year 1400, thought the greatest scholar yogi practitioners of India, where the Buddha did the vast majority of his teaching throughout his teaching career, where the great Indian monasteries for Buddhism sprung up, said these are the teachings of the Buddha. We have assessed them with our best scholarly minds, our best practice in terms of practice, doing the practices, and all of this is in line with the Buddhist teachings. That's where the tantras were preserved and then spread out to everywhere else, was from the Indian monasteries. Right. So, having said all of this, I hope I've given it enough attention. How is the question is not whether you need to accomplish the Four Noble Truths. You have to. You need to attain nirvana no matter which Buddhist system you're in. The question is, what method are you using to attain nirvana? That's one question. Another question is, what do you do once you have attained nirvana? There's a second question. And if I continue with examples from Mahayana. Oh, and by the way, everybody, please do pop your questions into the chat. Don't wait on me to say something interesting. If something's on your mind about Buddhism or meditation or the other things that I know about, please do pop it into the chat. So the other example I bring up quite often is Venerable Asanga. So Venerable Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu are extremely important to the Indian Buddhist tradition. Extremely, extremely, extremely important. Venerable Asanga meditated for 12 years in a cave. He spent 12 years doing meditation practices in a cave, hoping to meet Maitreya, the next Buddha. At the end of this, he says that he does directly meet Maitreya. Now, from a Pali Canon perspective, that's not unusual. From a Pali Canon perspective, if you trained sufficiently, even just in concentration, you should be able to visit the upper realms and converse with deities and other things. Maitreya, according to the Pali Canon, is living in Tushita heaven. So this is a being who should be available to you from a Pali perspective if you do enough practice, right? So this isn't even something unusual from a Pali standpoint. But anyways, so Asanga does all this practice. He encounters Maitreya finally after, I think it was 12 years. And after 12 years of practice, Maitreya says, okay, now that you've accumulated enough merit and gotten enough bad karma out of the way to see me and to visit the upper realms, let me take you to Tushita and I'll give you some teachings and you can bring them back. So he goes to Tushita. He receives 5 texts because in Tushita, time moves much more quickly than on Earth. And so he lives the equivalent of something like 3 months over the course of a few hours in one morning, receives the entire transmission of 5 texts, and brings those back, having memorized them in Tushita, and then he gives those teachings to his monastery when he returns to the monastery. His brother Vasubandhu writes commentaries, 5 commentaries, explaining the contents of those texts, and those 10 texts then become one of the most important parts of Mahayana practice that there is. Is that unusual from a Pali perspective? Not if you actually believe what the Pali Canon is saying. Anybody with sufficient jhana sufficient concentration training and meditation should be able to do something like this. So this isn't unusual. So it's only really if you're saying you don't believe that any of that is possible that you would say, oh, I need to reject what Asanga brought back. And then, so what do Asanga's teachings explain? Well, in the sutras that they were already struggling to explain in the, whatever it was, the 3rd century, 4th century, Asanga found all this stuff there that they couldn't explain what it meant. Maitreya, when he encountered Maitreya, explained what all of this stuff meant and gave him huge corpus of teachings to explain all this stuff that they didn't know what it meant in the sutras. And he brought it back, and his brother helped him write these commentaries on the texts. And so this then, as I said, becomes part of the Mahayana tradition for reasons that make sense from a Buddhist standpoint, right? It makes sense why that would be a valid way to get information from a Buddhist standpoint. even I think from a Pali standpoint. And what was the content of that? Well, one of the most important pieces of content was his explanation of how a person trains as a bodhisattva. How do you go from an ordinary being to a Buddha? What are the various levels? What is the difference between simply attaining nirvana as a person striving to attain nirvana only versus attaining nirvana if you want to carry on to Buddhahood? So these teachings become extremely, extremely important in explaining what is the actual process of training if you want to be a Mahayana practitioner. You see what I'm saying? So then you look at something, to go back again, you look at Venerable Nagarjuna. He says, look, the Nagas gave me some teachings, and these teachings now explain a huge corpus. Just look up Prajna Paramita, or Perfection of Wisdom literature. It is a huge body of literature in Buddhism, absolutely massive, and it is amongst the oldest materials, if not the oldest materials we have, from an archaeological standpoint, at least. Nagarjuna is the first one that we have in Buddhist history who actually explains all this material in such a way that we can make sense of it all. So whether or not you believe that he got that information from Nagas who stored it from the time of Shakyamuni Buddha until the 2nd century, right, in a sense is immaterial. But it should, as a Buddhist, if you believe the cosmology of Buddhism, that shouldn't be an outlandish idea that a great meditator could encounter these beings and that those beings might have gotten teachings from the Buddha, because the Buddha says repeatedly throughout the Pali Canon even, I teach gods and human beings. I teach all sorts of beings, not just human beings. But I digress. So you have then the Madhyamaka transmission, the middle way transmission coming through Nagarjuna, and you have the teachings of the higher bodhisattva kinds of teachings and the bodhisattva path teachings coming through a sangha, as well as a number of other things. Right. Okay. Now let's get back into questions. So Belle, it's been a while. It's good to see you again. If I just meditate more, will I master all of the issues I'm going through in life? They say meditation is the answer, but is it really? Great question, because I think quite often the answer is actually no, which I know will piss off a lot of Buddhists. So hang in there. Give me a minute to justify why I'm saying no. And if you still don't like it, then you can, then you know that this isn't the right channel for you. Buddhism, by and large, is a system in the West which we might call a wellness psychology. If we were trying to put it in Western frameworks, we would call it a wellness psychology. I've spoken about this before, but think about it like this. If you fall within the range of normal dysfunction as a person, because Buddhism says everyone who hasn't attained the state of an arhat or a Buddha, somewhere between being an arhat and being a Buddha, everyone else is dysfunctional to some degree. So within the realm of functionality, as you get closer to nirvana, you're getting more and more and more functional, more well, you could say, right? Less and less problems, less and less delusions, less and less negative karma, more and more positive karma and merit, etc., right? So everything's functioning better as you go this way. As you go this way, you have like the very sort of most people in the average here, and then you have people getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then at some point, it's beyond the normal range of dysfunction, right? These people are exceptionally dysfunctional. And Buddhism doesn't have much to do, doesn't have much advice and much help for these people, actually. These people that fall over here on the dysfunctional range, where it is so far outside of normal function that they can't even start doing anything to help themselves because of the type of issue they're struggling with, they need some other kind of help first. Now, at the time of the Buddha, I'll give you an example from his lifetime. When Kisha Gautami, if I'm not mistaken is her name, when Kisha Gautami visited the Buddha, she was carrying her dead son. This is a bit graphic, so again, bear with me. A lot of things you have to bear with me for tonight, I suppose. So Kisa Gautami's son had passed away. She's completely distraught. She's literally out of her mind, right? So we would put her over here. She's dealing with something so difficult, she has lost her mind. She's not in control of her faculties. She's going from holy man to medicine man to wise man with the dead body of an infant in her arms, asking them, "How do I heal my son? Can you please give me some medicine to heal my son?" And they're all telling her the same thing: your son is beyond the reach of help and medicine. And finally, someone says, "Go to the Buddha. Go to Gautama Buddha from the Shakya clan. He'll be able to help." And when she goes to the Buddha, as a good Buddhist, what he says is, everyone dies, just get over it, right? Because that's what you see on the internet when people are giving other people stupid advice coming from Buddhism. No, that's not what he did. By the way, let me just divert for a moment and say, if you're the type of person who goes on the internet and tells everyone every time they say anything about anything that everything is selfless and emptiness and meaningless and impermanent, and you need to calm down. You're hurting people. You're not helping people. The vast majority of the path happens over here in the realm of conventional reality, not over here in the realm of understanding emptiness and selflessness and applying that understanding to everything else. And if you can't do this part, you'll never do this part. You have to do the conventional part first, and it happens in a totally conventional way. I digress. So, no, of course, the Buddha doesn't heartlessly say, "Oh, yeah, just get over it. Everyone dies. Everything's impermanent. Don't you know?" No, what he says is, listen, because he can see that there's no way to explain this to her. She's not in her right frame of mind. He says, what I'd like you to do is get mustard seeds from one of the houses in this village. Except it has to be a house where no one has ever died. And she says, yes, of course, right away. And she goes from house to house to house to house looking for mustard seeds, which I'm assuming would have been a common in household sort of kitchen ingredient at the time. And every household says, no, I'm so sorry, someone has died here. And eventually, through hearing over and over and over, no, my uncle died here, my daughter died here, my son died here, my grandmother died here, my wife died here, going from house to house to house to house. It occurs to her in a flash, everyone dies. And it could happen any time. And she's suddenly able to understand. She's brought back to her senses. My son has passed away, and this is something natural, and there's nothing that can be done. And she's able to process, finally, right? She has been in massive denial, unbelievable denial through her grief, to the point where she's out of her mind. It's a heartbreaking story. Thank goodness she didn't encounter the modern Buddhist keyboard warrior who told her it was just all impermanent, right? Thank goodness she found the Buddha who said, go do something totally conventional that shows you that death is something we can't escape from. So at the time of the Buddha, even the Buddha himself didn't give his teachings, direct teachings on stuff like you'd be familiar with, Four Noble Truths, this and that, impermanence, oh, it's all disintegratedness, it's actually this and the right. No. He just gave her like a therapy, an exposure therapy approach, right? Go expose yourself to the fact that people die. And he didn't frame it that way. He just said, go find some mustard seeds, because he knew that she wouldn't be able to handle it said the other way. And so she goes, and she through exposure realizes what's going on and is able to come back to her senses. So what I tell people is, if you have some kind of major issue going on or your life is a mess, go get conventional help. If you're super depressed, talk to a therapist. If your marriage is falling apart, talk to a marriage counselor. If your business is failing, talk to somebody who knows more about business than you do. Don't, probably with respect to your lamas and so forth, you probably, the monks don't know very much about running your business. So if you're struggling with conventional stuff that puts you over here in above average dysfunction land, to the point where you're not even on the continent of people that can do normal practice. You're on the island of people who are like, you're so screwed up because of what's going on with you that you can't do practice right now, right? Doesn't mean that forever, but right now things are too screwed up for you to do anything meaningful. Go get normal help. If you're struggling because of lack of employment, go get employed. If you're like absolutely dying because you'd like romance, you know, talk to people that are good at understanding how it is that new relationships form and new friendships form. And like some of my students are like this too, where they're like, they didn't quite put it this way, but they're sort of like, I'd love to do more meditation, but I'm so lonely and I really want like a relationship and friends and whatever. And it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of stuff out there on how to find new friends and build relationships, and especially if you live in the world, the more stable and all of that is, the more time and energy and juice you'll be able to put into your practice and your study and all that, because you're not radically unhappy. So in terms of the original thought and question, right? If you're on this normal range of dysfunction, then Buddha's teachings will be quite helpful to you. If you're over here in on the island of above average dysfunction, then probably, unless you're already an experienced practitioner, what you need is conventional help. Some of that might be medication, not meditation. You know, if your ADD is so bad you can't even like go to the fridge without getting lost, maybe take a medication that gets you stable enough that you can go to the fridge without getting lost and then sit down and do 10 minutes of meditation. Because after 5 years of meditation, maybe you won't need as much medication. Maybe. Question mark. Maybe. Potentially. And as far as conventional problems goes, whatever else is going on with you, if you need help, get normal help. If it's drugs, if it's alcohol, if it's romance, if it's business, better, and it will be good enough that it's stable enough, your emotions are stable enough that you can do practice and do more study. Yeah? Okay. That's my advice. Hope that helps. Then in terms of meditation, of course, even the Western psychological data says if you do meditation over a long period, I mean, over a short period, they show all sorts of improvements on various kinds of disordered stuff, as long as you're doing the normal stuff that helps you not totally fall apart with your disorders. But if you're taking your medications and doing your therapy and doing all this other stuff, the conventional stuff, and then you add on some meditation with professional help, that professional could be like a licensed mindfulness-based stress reduction guy or girl, or it could be a monk or a nun teaching you in a traditional environment. But do it with professional help, because a lot of meditation without professional help can turn into delusion pretty quickly. Ask me how I know. I've met tons of people like that, who they see light, or they you know, I mean, I've done this with some people before. Like, I can teach you techniques where you'll see shimmering lights all over your visual field, and it doesn't take years. It takes like a couple of weeks maybe. Like, there's all sorts of stuff that can occur to you in meditation that's really weird because you're working with the thing that creates your reality. And most of what happens isn't that important and isn't that profound, except that it shows you that the great texts aren't lying when they say all this stuff, right? These are real things that happen if you do the practices. They're not super important other than showing you that, yep, we've been in this territory before. We mapped the terrain. We know what's going to happen to you when you go through the terrain because we've been over this before, right? That's why it's important. But meditation, yes, over a long period, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, of course, will be changing your mind and making your mind better and more comfortable and making the emotions and problems less, as long as you're doing it with the help of experienced people and you don't throw out the conventional help that's keeping you stable enough to do the work, if you have big problems, right? Okay. I know that was a long answer, but I feel like these deserve real answers. Okay. A real yogi lives rightly, acts out of charity, without craving results, remains untouched in the world of illusions while fully engaged in life. There's a funny saying, the great, the, a good yogi lives in the mountains. A great yogi lives in the city. Which is a bit opposite of how people think of it, you know. I've actually had more than one of my teachers say things like this to me. As normal people, we go, no, the great one is living in a cave somewhere and we'll never meet them. When in reality, unless you're living in a cave to show other people that these things are real, renunciation is real, these capabilities are real, etc., if you have to live in a cave to do your practice, then you aren't as capable as a person who can do those practices without leaving the world. Case in point, Marpa the translator versus Milarepa. Almost everybody talks about Milarepa because he lived in caves and he lived an extreme lifestyle of renunciation physically. But take note, Marpa is actually the one, this rich kid who goes to India, trains with all these great yogis, learns Sanskrit, brings these practices back, establishes multiple tantric lineages in Tibet, right? Including the practices that Milarepa ends up doing. So who's the great yogi? The one who has to go to the caves? Or Marpa, who's living there with however many children and his 7 wives and his great estate full of stuff and can still do all the practices? Which one is the greater yogi? For myself, I look at the inspiring examples of history as a layperson. Going all the way back to the Buddha, there are numerous examples of great meditators who were lay people. Right back to the time of the Buddha, there are 2 whose names I can't remember off the top of my head, but they were revered as great meditators from the lay community. Nobody ever talks about these people, but they're there in the historical record of Buddhism. Furthermore, there are examples like Vimalakirti. There are examples like Marpa. There are examples like Venerable Atisha's first student. What's his name? I'm forgetting his name, but he was a lay person. He was a lay Tibetan, and he was ironically, he was an expert on Vinaya. He was extremely capable practitioner. He was also, I believe, a translator for Venerable Atisha. For those of you who don't know, Venerable Atisha is part of the second wave of Buddhism into Tibet. He was one of the great scholar yogis of the Nalanda tradition at the time. And the royal family had invited him to come to Tibet to reestablish Buddhism there because it was their opinion that Buddhism had begun to decline a little bit in Tibet. And Venerable Atisha's highest, greatest student was a layperson. Think about this. So you have these great examples of incredible practitioners again and again throughout Buddhist history who are not monks and nuns, they're lay people. This is not to say monks and nuns and retreat-dwelling yogis are like, so much for that or something. I'm not saying that at all. Those are incredible, incredible beings, incredible examples. And I have great admiration for anybody that wants to do that sort of thing. But what it means is this: we don't really have an excuse as lay people living in the real world. It seems like we do because we have other stuff to do, but there are types of practices that you can do anytime, anywhere. Mahamudra style practice you can do while doing anything. Okay. If Nagarjuna says everything and even the Dharma is empty, why care to do practice? It's empty. So, Ajanta Caves. So listen. So the question is a really important one. But the question implies something that's wrong. And this is something a lot of people get wrong. So it's not something to be embarrassed about or something. But a lot of people outside Buddhism, a lot of people who are first encountering these ideas, they get this wrong. Ask yourself this question: what is the thing that is empty? Because if there's something there that is empty, then the question has to be, what is it empty of? Because something that doesn't exist at all can't be empty of anything because it's not there. So then the question would be, it's sort of a weird question, right? Like, why would you practice the Dharma if it lacks something that you thought was there but isn't there? That's like saying, if like, why would I don't know. I can't think of a good example. But why would I go to the beach to get like 50 incredible experiences that are at the beach if one of those 50 is something that I hallucinated that was never there at the beach? Do you understand what I mean? Why would I get married and have the 2,000 benefits that come from marriage if I was hallucinating one benefit, or I was delusional about one benefit that doesn't actually exist in marriage? The other 1,999 are there. There's just one that I was delusional about. The Dharma is empty of one particular thing you thought was there that isn't there. Who cares? I mean, I'm being a little bit funny about it, but this is really important. You can flip the language on its head a little bit, because shunyata comes from a philosophical tradition that doesn't have roots in common with English and the Greek traditions and the Christian traditions of philosophy. So when we hear empty, we think non-existent or meaningless. That's not what's being said here at all. What's being said here is that this exists dependently. So let me ask you this. If you investigate a dependently existent thing, will you find that it exists independently? Why would you? Why would you find a thing that exists dependently also existing independently? And since it exists dependently, all of the qualities that you thought were there, like taking you from where you are to nirvana, if it was the path to nirvana, right? The path to nirvana exists dependently, doesn't it? It's a dependent arising? Okay, no problem. You know how it doesn't exist? As an independent arising, because it's a dependent arising. Everything else you got right about it. It's a path that really does lead from where you are to a real thing called nirvana. What you got wrong about it is that you thought it existed independently, when in fact it exists dependently. No problem. Just fix the thing you got wrong. So instead of saying empty, sometimes I just say that it's not independently existent, or it's not. My favorite way of talking about it actually is it's not non-relationally existent. This is the best language I've come up with for this. This exists because of relationships between all sorts of things. Subject and object, between parts and whole, between causes and effects. It exists because of relationships. So when you look for a mug that doesn't exist, when you look for a mug that exists without depending upon relationships, a non-relational mug, you don't find one. No problem. No problem at all. This is a relationally existent mug. Why would there be a non-relationally existent mug inside? Well, the only reason this non-relational thing is a problem is because all of our perceptions are screwed up. We have a cognitive error in which we see everything. The room you're sitting in, your hand, your own mind, the lights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, all the things you touch, all the touches on the body, etc. All of those, you see them existing non-relationally at some level. Maybe the most obvious ones you've gotten rid of because we have a modern education and whatever, and we study this stuff as when you do your science 101 course, right? Maybe you've gotten rid of the stupidest versions of that. But we still have baked into our perceptions subtler versions of seeing things existing non-relationally. And it's on that psychological basis that all of your negative mental states arise, according to Buddhism. So if you could remove that, the negative mental states go away and you attain nirvana. If you could remove even the subtle things that remain, they sometimes say attaining nirvana is like removing the garlic from the bowl. You've removed the garlic from the bowl. If you want to attain Buddhahood, now you need to remove the smell of the garlic that still remains after the raw garlic has been removed, right? So to remove all of this stuff, you just need to remove this ignorance thing, this misperception thing. You see this as non-relationally existent cup, and therefore, since it exists somehow out here, utterly independent of relationships in the way that it actually exists, you go, oh, this cup has something in it or about it that could make me happy. If I could just get 10 more like that, or if it could just be mine. My precious cup. It's sort of like the golem attitude. If you could just sit around being intimate with it and caring for it, and right, that somehow you'd be happy. That's attachment. Exaggerating what the qualities of the object, exaggerating the positive qualities of the object and what it could provide you. You see? So you can only do that if you think this exists non-relationally out here in the world with its own qualities. If you didn't believe that, you couldn't do it. So, yeah, I mean, everything exists dependently, or you could say everything exists relationally, including the Dharma, including Nirvana, including Buddhahood, etc. And it's a problem that you see it existing non-relationally, but totally contrary to what you think as a normal person. If you could see it the way that it is, it would have meaning, it would have purpose, it would have value. It wouldn't be meaningless, because things exist depending upon relationships, including the relationship between you and the object. So meaning, value, purpose, etc. are part of how things exist. Okay. Let me carry on in the chat. I hope that helps. What are the Nagas? The Nagas are a race of very intelligent yet stingy and greedy beings who resemble very large snakes. They're part of the wider Indian pantheon of sort of deity-like beings. Yeah, and you find them, as far as I know, I think you find them in all of the Buddhist metaphysical systems. Ajanta says, please make more videos reacting to Christian and Islamic scholars trying to dismantle Buddhism. I plan to. It's definitely on the agenda. I've been working really, really hard on... I was working really, really hard on the 18 Lohan project, and I'm getting to a place now where I'm feeling like that project is very nearly where it needs to be, so that I can get back to making the other content that I would normally make. So keep on the lookout. I've been meaning to I'm going to make a video on the Kalama Sutta, because it's an extremely, extremely misunderstood text in the modern world. And it's important for Buddhists, in my humble opinion, to understand what's actually going on with that text, which is not at all what it seems on the surface, and is certainly not what you've heard. So going to be doing that, and then I'm going to be jumping into whatever comes up next. A couple more podcast guests coming up, and definitely much more in the future where I'm responding to folks saying funny things about Buddhism that are not true. Okay. Acharya says, the mustard seed was a decoy to see the ubiquitous nature of death. Her pain is not special. I think it's a little subtler. I think in modern terms we might think about it as exposure therapy. The Buddha said, okay, I can't predict exactly what's in the Buddha's mind, of course, but if I were humbly personifying the line of reasoning, at least, he sees a person that's completely overwhelmed by grief, to the point where they're so out of their mind, they are literally carrying around the corpse of a young child, which is a pretty extreme thing to do, because she had been doing this for days. So you can imagine the condition things must have been in. And he sends her out to be exposed to the idea repeatedly in different houses over and over and over and over again that nobody can get away from death. So, I think it's not just that he was trying to show her that it's ubiquitous, that everybody experiences this. I think that he was trying to put her through a process of exposure, of exposing her to this thing that she didn't want to accept as real. Because obviously she's denying it's real if she's running around asking for healing for her child when her child, you know, has been deceased for several days and she's carrying around the remains. Again, a bit of an extreme example. So for those who aren't into that kind of example, my apologies. We shall carry on. Maitri, thank you for the contribution. Yes, just very briefly, since we're at about an hour. So I'm going to carry on going through the chat, answering your questions. Let me just say for everyone who's here or who stumbles on this later, if you find this and you're getting some value out of it, I do all this for free. Everything that I teach, I have a free version of it available somewhere. If you wanted to support what I'm doing, a great way to do it is drop a donation, whatever you can. Whatever amount you can is very much appreciated, because some people can't contribute anything at all, and I want to be available for them too. I have a number of students who don't pay me anything at all. If you could donate whatever you can through the PayPal or the Venmo, that would be the very best way to contribute. If you wanted to train with me a little bit more seriously in meditation, I have a meditation course linked down below, the 5 foundations of meditation, where I'm teaching you how to train in meditation while still living in the real world. A very, very important set of skills. I have those for free available here on YouTube, but I have way more resources organized much more nicely. And the whole community is training in these techniques together through the 5 Foundations course. So it's more rich. That's a great way to support my more wider teaching efforts if you're so inclined. And then also, if you wanted to do something physical, quite a few people are doing Hindu yogas, quite good. But they also have versions of these practices that come through the Chinese systems that are primarily Buddhist. One of those systems that's primarily Buddhist is called the 18 Arhat Palm system, the 18 Arhat Palm system. And Neil Ripsky, who I had on the podcast, is a lineage holder for that system. And I've designed we're in the process of building a course together. We have the first, I can't remember how many weeks we're on now, like 8 weeks or 10 weeks of material. So you can jump into that course if you'd like. That's another great way to support what I'm doing. And I'm going to be doing retreats in person for that material as time goes on. So 18 Lohan Palm has yoga, qigong, internal martial arts. It's all wrapped into one package that's basically coming through primarily a Buddhist transmission of how to work with your body and your energy system. So very rare, very precious, and that would be a great way to connect with me at a deeper level and to support financially my ability to carry on doing this from month to month for free for everyone else. So please do chip in, hit pause, follow a link, chip in, whatever you can. It really means a lot. Acharya says, Theravada claims Buddha had magical powers such as miraculous healings or walking on water. Is this true? Yes, it is. The Theravada, the Pali Canon, the Agamas, the Sanskrit Canon, the Tibetan Canon, every canon that I know of says the Buddha had miraculous powers. I don't consider miracles to be the right word. I call them supernormal powers, because I think anything that happens is within the realm of nature, not miraculous in the sense of being above nature. I think whatever higher capabilities, siddhis, exist, I think they come through training, and they're part of the natural how the world works. They're just not normal. They're not something that most people have because they haven't trained to have those skills or develop those capabilities. So yeah, I used to come down on the other side because I've been trained as an academic. You can't get a Buddhist-related PhD without reading a huge amount of skeptical material about Buddhism and encountering a lot of academics who don't believe any of this stuff and think it's all a bit kind of funny and hokey, right? However, I've gone the extra step and actually done the practices for a long time, and I've hung out with practitioners for a long time. And what's really surprised me is that, in spite of myself, in spite of thinking, I can't believe this stuff because it's too weird, right? I would love if I could, but I can't. This is how I used to think, right? I would meet monks. I would meet practitioners, lay practitioners. I'd meet great meditators, and they would do things that were like what I had read in the great texts. And because I have literally in front of my eyes seen people do things that are like what I read in the mythology. Because of this, even as a skeptical person, I don't have as much reservation. Well, also as a practitioner training, there have been things in my own practice where things have happened or had experiences or whatever, and that's given me the sense that probably more than you would imagine, more than you would imagine from a introductory reading of Buddhism turns out to not be mythology. Most of it, I think, turns out to be real stuff if you just do the practices. All right. What's the dividing line between delusion and divine vision? Okay. The dividing line between delusion and divine vision is that if it turns out that a huge amount of the stuff that you are supposedly getting from beings who are beyond the human realm, let's say, if it turns out that a huge amount of that is horse hooey, doesn't lead to where it was told you it would lead, where when you investigate it more deeply, for example, you're given specific information and you investigate it more deeply and that information is wrong, this is a strong indication that your mind is delusional, that your mind is generating stuff that isn't there rather than you getting special information. Here's the thing. Even if it's your mind generating weird stuff, our mind is a pattern-seeking, incredible machine, right? You're literally sitting in this room or your room, wherever you are, outside, whatever. Your mind is generating the experience of that entire 3D reality with 5 different aspects: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touch, while thinking stuff at the same time. Your mind is this unbelievable machine designed to create stuff that seems real to you. That's what it does. It creates reality. It creates real stuff in terms of experience, right? So this incredible pattern-seeking, pattern-creating, reality-building machine can sometimes, even when you're delusional about something, like most of our dreams are just a bunch of random mishmash of weird stuff, even there can sometimes pull information from different places and present you with something that, despite the fact that it's not real or that it's a dream or it's a hallucination, has information in it that's true and accurate and whatever, because this is what your mind does. It tries to present you with information that's true and accurate and helpful for whatever it is you're doing, right? This is what our mind is very, very, very good at doing. So some of your delusional experiences might have content that's helpful. That doesn't mean you should continue seeking them out. Are you with me? Like, if 19 out of 20 of them lead you down rabbit holes that are like absolutely useless, it would be better if you didn't have the one that sometimes kind of helped. Just throw out the whole lot. You know? It's better to not be delusional or to be only an average amount of delusional. Okay. Moises, hello, good to see you. I found out yesterday the Buddha died because of food poisoning. Nope, that's not true. If he knew that it's poison, why proceed eating it? That's not true. So there is a medical person at some point who said when they read the description of how the Buddha died, it sounds to them like it was food poisoning. There's also a description in the canon of the Buddha eating either pork or eating mushrooms that are a type of mushroom that a pig would eat. The term itself in the Pali is vague. It's a vague term that could mean either one. In any case, typically it is understood to be that he ate pork for his final meal. When you go to the sutra where he's describing, or the sutta where he's describing his passing away, he says, it is not the case that I was killed by the meal that I was fed by this person. And I don't want it being said after I die that that person is to blame for killing me because they gave me bad food. So there's some interpretive thing that's been applied later where they go, oh, well, it looks like he ate this pork and it wasn't good and then he died. But according to the canon, that's not what happened. The Buddha, it was just it was just time for the Buddha to die. And he died. That was the last meal he ate. But he even says to Kunda, the blacksmith, he says, I'm paraphrasing, but says something to the effect of, don't feel regret. Don't let your mind be disturbed. Feeding a Buddha their final meal is unbelievably meritorious. He says there are a few things that are unbelievably meritorious. Feeding the Buddha when they're, I think, right before that first meal before he went to sit under the Bodhi tree, feeding them that meal, if I'm not mistaken. Feeding them. The second is building a monastery, and I believe the third was feeding them their last meal. He said these are unbelievably meritorious things, and you should have no bad feelings about it at all. So he says this, and then he also says, no one should blame him for my death. So if somebody carelessly had fed old food to the Buddha and killed him, he wouldn't be saying, this is unbelievably good karma. Because inadvertently poisoning a holy being is not good karma. That's really, 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 really bad karma. Out of your carelessness, you killed an incredibly holy being. That's not good karma. That's bad karma. So, according to the canon, the Buddha was not at all killed by eating his last meal. According to the canon, the Buddha's time had come. Okay. Mugao. Good evening from Edinburgh, Mugao. Wajtek, hello. Good to see you. Mugao, I am in Edinburgh, so it is 11:51 p.m. Acharya 8017. Let's see. More questions about emptiness. Well, lots of emptiness questions. Let me see. Okay, I'll come to you in a moment, Mugao. I gotta get back to emptiness. Everybody likes when I talk about emptiness. I'm gonna say something now that will take you many years if you haven't heard this before for it to sink in. The ultimate nature of reality exists conventionally. The ultimate nature of reality exists conventionally. The only things that exist in reality are things that exist conventionally. There is nothing whatsoever, even down to the fraction of anything, even to the ultimate nature of things that exists ultimately. If emptiness existed ultimately, what you would be saying is that the relational existence of this cup exists ultimately. You understand? Then you would be saying that the final nature of being relational exists non-relationally. So you would, by necessity, you would be establishing the inherent nature of this thing as being inherently empty instead of being empty of relationality. And therefore, you'd be establishing that this thing inherently exists by maintaining the position that you just put forward. I know that's going to go for like 99 out of 100 people that hear this, but maybe one it'll go and stick somewhere. This is amongst the most important arguments in the entire corpus about emptiness philosophy. Emptiness means things exist relationally. That's actually the definition of emptiness. Things exist because they depend on relationships. So what about emptiness? Does that depend upon relationships? Yeah. This cup is empty of being a non-relational cup. So if we take away the cup, we also lose the absence of a non-relational cup. One more time. We have a relational cup. That means that its nature is an absence of non-relationality. If we throw away the cup and the cup is completely destroyed, we also lose the absence of non-relationality of this particular cup. Which means that the absence of non-relationality in regards to the mode of existence of this cup exists conventionally. What does conventional mean? It means that things exist based upon a whole nexus of relationship, not just causality. Causality also exists as a nexus of relationship. Causality doesn't inherently exist either. Causality exists relationally. Parts and whole exist relationally. Subject and object exist relationally. There's nothing that exists non-relationally, including the absence of non-relationality. The absence of non-relationality, i.e. emptiness, only exists because there are relational things. Relational things have a nature of being or of having non-relationality, the absence of that, as part of their nature. Why is it part of their nature? Part of the makeup of this thing in terms of how it exists is that there's nothing inside that doesn't exist absent relationships. You with me? And that fact about the object, that there's nothing about it that exists independent of relationships, depends upon the object, doesn't it? I can't have the fact that the cup exists only dependent upon relationships. If I get rid of the cup, there's nothing left to lack that quality of existing independent of relationships. So what does this mean? This means that emptiness exists conventionally. Selflessness exists conventionally. Emptiness is empty of inherent existence. The absence of inherent existence is empty of inherent existence. Why? Because it depends upon the existence of conventional things in order to exist. So, German, this is self-empty, Rangtong, not Shentong. This is saying that when you look for an inherently existent cup, which would be the self of the cup, yeah? When you look for that, you don't find it. Shentong would say this cup is empty of other, although that's not really the Shentong argument. The Shentong argument's about the subtlest nature of your own consciousness, and saying that subtlest nature of your own consciousness is not empty of itself. It's only empty of absolutely everything else, which we could have debates about. Okay, hopefully that helps. We've got a stream enterer. Mugao, what do you think of Nietzsche? Do you think he had an awful understanding of Buddhism? Yes. I don't think I've ever read a classical Western philosopher that had a good understanding of Buddhism. I have read quite a few that read a bit of Buddhism, thought some of it was cool, modified it extremely heavily, and incorporated it into their own work, having Oh, there's a really terrible quote by Voltaire that I should never say in public. But basically, Voltaire had this idea that, when you're doing philosophy, it's so he was responding to a critic, and the critic said, I think Voltaire, I think what you've done is run roughshod over the ideas of all these other philosophers without really understanding them, and then you've just sort of said whatever you wanted. And Voltaire responded by saying, uh, philosophy is a sort of buggery. and philosophical writing is the child of that buggery that he produces with great pleasure. I think that those are the terms that I'll leave it in. But you take the image, right? There's quite a few Western philosophers, I think, especially classical ones, who thought you start with the work of another author. You don't necessarily need to even understand 100% what they intended to say. You just need to be inspired by that to give birth to this new thing that is the continuation of thought, even though it's not even fully representing what the other person thought. And that's the attitude he's expressing there, even though you can't produce a child with buggery. Right? But, anyways, the whole point is that he's producing this new line of thought based upon his own inspiration by the ideas. And even into the 80s, the 1980s, there are people that I read in the course of doing my PhD thesis who said that Madhyamaka thought, for example, middle way thought, amounts to such and such, or this and this and this, and will even outright say in their own work, yeah, but this is just my take on it. I don't think I'm not even representing the what the tradition thinks. I'm representing what I've taken away and using that as a starting point to do my own work. Fine, no problem. Just don't call it Buddhism, It's definitely not. Okay. Next question. Do you think that materialism has much in common with creationism? I think both leave you with different kinds of problems that, of course, Buddhist philosophy has its own challenges because of the type of the way, in particular with authority. The way that you establish the authority of certain things can be challenging in Buddhism because it's not a tradition actually, in terms of certain things, it's not a tradition that says we logically worked this out and it's like this, and despite what people think. And so it has a revelatory character in some ways that's similar to creationism, where the Buddha said, I had an experience under the Bodhi tree that I remembered infinite past lives. So why do Buddhists say that there's infinite time into the past and infinite numbers of universes into the past, and that rebirth has no beginning? Because the Buddha said, I saw it in meditation. And then subsequently, his students, his early students, the early commentators, other great yogis all throughout history have said, yeah, when I did the practices, it was exactly like the Buddha said. And so, all the way up to modern times, by the way, there are practitioners like Venerable Mahabua and some yogis from the Yogis of Tibet documentary who said the same thing. You do these practices and you recall all of your past lives, which are infinite. So we have to take something like that on the word of great yogis. We can make logical arguments for it, which I've done numerous times on the channel, but that's not the reason we say it's true, because it's logically possible. We say it's true because great yogis have told us from their direct experience this is how it is. Same thing with karma, for example, as the foundation of ethics. Karma is not something beyond a very limited access in terms of logic and reasoning, is not something that you can get at with logic and reasoning to explain the entire thing. The Buddha's second realization under the Bodhi tree was sentient beings move up and down according to their actions. Let's just bring it into English. Actions. What they do. What they do with their body, what they do with their speech, what they do with their mind leaves these imprints on their consciousness. And those formations on their consciousness influence and create their own futures, such that they end up going up or down, high status, low status, high rebirth, low rebirth, etc., taking rebirth mainly in 6 realms of different kinds of existence across 3 different possible spheres of experience: desire, form, or formlessness. And we accept this not because he logically worked it out, but because he said, I went and sat under the Bodhi tree. I looked at it, and it was like that. When I looked out at the minds of sentient beings, it was like this, right? I don't think he said it like that. He was probably much more calm. So similarly, the great yogis through the course of time have reported that they see the similar things. It's exactly like this. There's a very moving interview with Venerable Mahabua. Not really interview, but he's giving a teaching, and he recorded quite a few teachings where he was teaching lay people. And he says, it's exactly like this. He said, when I was doing my practice and this happened, that happened, and I stretched out with clairvoyance and I looked, and it turned out, and he wasn't being biased at the time, according to him at least. He just said, I looked out to see what it was actually like. And he said it was exactly like the Buddha described, with beings going up and down and going to lower realms and this and that. And he said it was all real. So we have to deal with this issue of, let's call it the issue of authority, because part of the fundamental stuff that we believe as Buddhists comes through great yogis, not through logic, not through reasoning, but through the direct report of beings who have great experience in meditative practice. So creationism has its own issues because, for example, let's say that you had one person who believes in the world is created by a single deity and this is the only universe that's ever existed, and when you die you go to heaven or you go to hell and those last forever. Okay, fine. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that's how it is. No problem. All right. Next, if you say that ethics is something that comes about because there is a thing in the world that is the good, called God. And as you move away from the good, let's go this way. As you move away from the good, you become not good, evil. Now, we could debate about the nature of evil. Is it a positive entity of non-good, or is it a privation? Is it simply the absence of good? And there have been debates about this. Not so important for this conversation. And then there's the good, which is obviously the presence of something that is the good. Okay, fine. When we're talking about both evil and good, we have some challenges, because if what is good and what is evil are established on the basis of the nature of an objectively existent being, and the only way to know the qualities of that being is by revelation, and if we have different revelations telling us different things about the ethics of a particular circumstance, then we're stuck, right? We just have to do our best and decide what's the best thing to do here based upon I don't know what, because how do you know whose revelation is correct if all of them are considered valid revelatory authorities in the tradition? What do you do? And then furthermore, on top of that, we're not dealing with the direct revelation anymore. We're dealing with interpretation, hundreds of years of interpretation. And we're dealing with all of these different schools now of how to interpret the theological positions. Who's right? Hard to say. And we don't actually have any way to really ultimately parse who got it right and who didn't. But unless we're a faith-only Christian, and creationism is not only Christian, right? We have Muslim creationists, we have Jewish creationists, we have Hindu creationists, we have, I think also the Jains fall into this category. There are also Zoroastrians, if I'm not mistaken. There are a whole host of creationism. They come on a whole spectrum of stuff. But if you're not in any of those traditions and they don't agree on a whole bunch of stuff in ethics, which they don't, there's a ton they don't agree on across these traditions, how do you know who's right? There's actually no objective criteria to use to decide I'm going to follow this one instead of this one instead of this one or whatever. So there's just a ton of difficulty in deciding which way to go. On the Buddhist side, it's a little bit more simple. Everyone basically agrees in Buddhism there are 10 good actions and 10 bad actions. You should do the good ones and avoid the bad ones. So that's not a problem that we have in the same way as all of the theological camps. There is some more debate when we get into bodhisattva ethics, but we still agree on the groundwork for those ethics in terms of the 6 perfections or the 10 perfections or whichever model you want to use. It becomes a little bit more complex in Tantra, but not that much different, actually. Big sort of discussion, can of worms there, but all of the stuff that related to the previous levels of ethics still apply here at the final level, but there's questions about now what all of this was based upon and whether or not all of that is still there at the final levels of training or it's not. Because if the reason for this ethics has been changed because you have changed, then the type of ethics you need is not the same anymore as it was when you were over here. That being said, for the vast majority of us, we still need to do all of the pratimoksha ethics and all the bodhisattva ethics and everything else, right? Like, unless you attain a pretty high level of capability in this life, you need to carry on with normal ethics as a Buddhist. And okay, now in terms of materialism, materialism likewise has its own challenges because basically materialism could end up a number of places, but mostly ends up in various kinds of agnosticism, where they just say, well, we don't know enough to know about that. So it's another position where it doesn't lead to specific action and has a lot of gray area. And from a Buddhist standpoint, the Buddha actually, a lot of people don't know this, but the Buddha rejected agnosticism. There were agnostics at the time of the Buddha. And the Buddha specifically pointed out agnosticism and rejected it as a worldview. In addition, also, surprises a lot of people, he also rejected the idea of a creator God. So both of those went out the window, according to the Buddha. And he rejected materialism. There were physicalists at the time of the Buddha, and he rejected this also. Okay, I digress. So, do they share much in common? I think what all worldviews share in common is at some points in them you find pain points, you find difficult points. And as human beings, we all just have to kind of live with the difficult points of whatever philosophical view we've been convinced of for now, you know? From a Buddhist standpoint, eventually you can train in meditation, answer all of the questions from direct experience, and you're off to the races. On the other hand, according to creationism, eventually you die, and if you were a good Christian or Muslim or whatever, you go to the heavenly realm of Christ, and you hang out there, and your questions are answered, I guess, right? Or you go the other way, and your questions are answered in a really unfortunate way. So, the materialists, likewise. Quite often, I think the most honest materialists that I have heard of and read, they don't say outright that none of this stuff exists. They say, I haven't seen very good evidence that anything beyond the physical exists. Fair enough. Okay. You know, I hadn't either 21 years ago. I have now. There's some stuff you can do if you'd like to see. There's some philosophical work you can do today if you'd like to see and understand that materialism probably isn't correct. And then in addition to that, there's meditative work you can do to look and see whether or not, for example, consciousness actually is non-physical. This is something within reach. With a few years of training, you can look at what consciousness is and see if it has the properties of a physical thing insofar as you can tell. And those who have done that kind of training and seen what consciousness is from direct experience, generally speaking, from the practitioners I've spoken with over the years, it's like obvious that it's not. As a philosopher, I might still say, well, it's possible that it looks that way, but still somehow it's physical. Okay, fine. You know, if I'm playing devil's advocate with myself, you could still say that. But philosophically, actually, it's a much better explanation that consciousness is non-physical rather than physical. And so I think as a materialist, you have a ton of difficulty and vagueness and stuff you have to juggle, just like the creationists, just like the Buddhists, just like the Hindus, just like the Jains. Everybody has difficulties at different levels of their thought. And this is what we all have in common. The other thing that we have in common is we're all trying to build good lives. We're all struggling to figure out what do we do with our life? What is the right thing to do? You know, what should I be spending my time doing? What is it that hurts me and hurts other people? How do I get the most good stuff out of life for me and the people I care about? Maybe if you're a little bit more sophisticated, how do I make sure that the world turns out better for everyone? If you're going a little further, why are we here at all? What's the purpose of all this? Is there any meaning to all of this beyond eating, defecating, and sleeping? You know? Is there meaning to this beyond the immortal gene, beyond the passing on your seed to the next generation? You know? We're all struggling to answer these questions, and that's why there are so many different worldviews, and we all have to deal with the difficulties that come with having accepted the positions we've accepted. And honestly, I think the consequences of holding these views are quite high, unless you genuinely don't care about any of this sort of thing. If you have that itch in your heart, that sort of, or that fire in your heart to figure out whether or not there's something more going on, it's pretty intolerable to not have answers to these kinds of things, I think. But some people who don't have that, you know, they go to work, they have a beer when they get off, they hang out and do whatever they like in their free time, and none of this presses on them at all, I guess, you know. But most people, I do think, actually have some sort of, in religious studies, sometimes, I can't remember the author, but they say, you know, human beings are religious animals. And when you look at the archaeological record, as far back as we can see, human beings have been practicing things that indicate that even beyond modern civilization, human beings were thinking probably that there's something more to life than just sort of, how to say, that we're not just the body, that there's something more beyond death. So I know that's not quite the question you asked, but I figured I would use that as an opportunity to say these other things that are on my mind. I hope you don't mind. Okay. Moises Antonio. Can one consider progressing in the path when understanding the path more with time? Can one consider progressing in the path when understanding the path more with time? I think I understand what you're saying. I tend to think about Buddhist training in this way. The more you train, the more you find that your behavior becomes consistent. But in addition to becoming consistent, your mind becomes flexible. So you're more comfortable with things not being consistent, but you're also more consistent. And your emotions are more stable. Your mind is more capable. Your mind isn't as dragged by all of the things that up to now it has been dragged by. Less anger, less attachment, less lust, less hatred. So as your mind gets more stable, your behavior gets more consistent. Also, what should happen, I think, is mind has a creative aspect. Consciousness has a creative aspect. It's literally creating an entire universe as you sit here in terms of perceptual experience, right? 6 different realms of perceptual experience simultaneously. Your mind is an unbelievably creative and flexible thing. So as you do more practice, your mind should also become more flexible. So instead of becoming more sort of rigid and stuck in your own stuck, you should become capable of more and more flexibility in the things that you do. And that doesn't mean that you become a wishy-washy kind of floppy person. It means that you're able to adapt and respond without stopping, to borrow from a pretty famous phrase, a pretty famous phrase from somewhere else. You can adapt and respond without stopping. Whereas before, if things changed, you would be unable to adapt, unable to respond, and you'd have to stop for long periods of time and probably have great distress. So I think these are signs of making progress. Of course, having more understanding is good too, but your increased understanding should be leading to these other things that are actual transformations of your mind. So Acharya 8017 says that they like the framing of supernormal. Yeah, yeah. I've been thinking about that a long time because you find similar things in the Chinese internal arts and health and Chinese internal health arts and Qigong, Neigong. I've trained in those for a fair amount of time in addition to the Buddhist things. But like I said, I've encountered practitioners that can do some of the stuff you read about in the great texts, which is why, despite my skepticism, I believe the things that I believe now because I've had direct experiences of these things. And so when I look at those people, it's not like they were graced by a deity or something and that's how they're doing it. They've just done a ton of practice. They have developed a capability because they did a lot of practice that allowed them to do something that most people can't do. So it's not supernatural. It's not miraculous. It's not magical. It's a skill that lies outside the realm of normal capability. In other words, it's supernormal. It's above what normal people can do. So I find that way of thinking and talking much more useful when it comes to all of this stuff, personally. Okay. So Bell says, I've encountered teachers who imagine me trying to, who encourage me to imagine trying to connect with deities and interact with them. Can that be helpful or detrimental? I think if you have the predisposition to have fantasies and delusions that you can't distinguish from reality, then doing deity related practices is not a good idea. Because you will inevitably create new types of hallucinations that involve those beings, mixed now with spiritual feelings, and the potential for some type of spiritual, what's the word? Psychosis becomes higher. And actually, even in the corpus, let's say, of teachings where they talk about doing various types of deity-related practices, et cetera, there are warnings not to teach these things to people because they can make you go nuts. So it's important, I would say, actually, that you focus on stuff. If you have a mind that tends towards the fantastical, tends towards just hallucination, delusion, that you focus on real stuff as much as you can. Your breath is actually here. Your body is actually here. The visual field, absent stuff you're imagining and adding to the field, is actually here. Sound, actually here. Absent the stuff that you're adding from consciousness that is not actually in the auditory field, and so forth. So if you get really good at practices where you're actually contacting the different types of experiences you have, and you get better at discerning the difference between a mentally generated experience and a perceptually, empirically generated experience, I think that would be to your benefit. I don't think it would be to your benefit to start thinking that certain categories of delusions or hallucinations you're having are beneficial. Right. Now, having said this, if you don't have those predispositions, if you don't have the predisposition to that kind of thing because of whatever thing you have going on, those practices can be extremely beneficial. So it depends on you, not the thing itself. There's tons of practices related to deities and so forth that are really, really helpful. They're mostly imaginative exercises. Whether or not the deities are there is an open question for you as a practitioner to explore in time. But on your side, it's an imaginative exercise, at least for a period of time, where you're imagining something that represents all of the good qualities you want to possess, and then imagining that being possessing all the qualities you want to possess. You're imagining, for example, that all of your gurus, all your teachers, all of the great beings, all of their minds are collecting in this visualized image. And then that image is transferring light to you, and that light contains all of the realizations of the path. It contains all of the good qualities. It removes all your negative qualities, etc., right? So this imaginative exercise is adding weight and power to your feelings of faith, devotion, respect, humility, refuge, etc., and is much more effective than simply sort of reading the written words, etc. Because you're using visual image, sound, etc. I'm starting to sound like that guy from I just keep saying etc. So by combining symbol with meaning, rather than just using word symbolic stuff in terms of words, by combining image and so forth, right? Visualized image, it has much more impact on your psychology. So this is the benefit. But if you have a predisposition towards crazy stuff, it's probably not the right practice for you, because it will cause you to think more crazy stuff. Okay. So Antonio asks, do I accumulate bad karma by killing a spider? How does karma work? So from a karmic theory perspective, karma just means action, right? So an action has four main components. So there's the object of the action. What is it that you are acting upon? So you're acting upon, let's say, the spider, right? And then there's the motivation and intention for the action. Why are you acting upon the spider, and what do you intend to do to the spider? So maybe you're acting upon it because you're scared and you don't like scary spiders, and the intent is to kill the spider. And then there's the effort, is the fourth part. There's the effort of the action. Effort in this case just means all the stuff you do in order to prepare to kill the spider. So you go and you get the shoe from next to your door, and you put the shoe in your hand in a certain way so that the spider can't jump on you if it suddenly jumps off the wall. And you take your time because you understand spiders will run away if I don't move exactly the right way, and I don't want it to land on the floor, and blah, blah, blah. So all this thinking too, right? Like you're thinking it through and planning it and figuring it out, and then whack. And then there's the completion of the action, which is you seeing yourself kill that being. And then sometimes also, one of my teachers said that there's sort of an attitude that comes along with the completion where you go, yeah, I got him. So there's sort of a feeling also that comes along with the completion. So you see them die, you see the spider die, and then you go, got him. Right? Yes. That bastard's gone. So in terms of karmic theory, if you have all four of the components of an action, then you've accumulated the karma. You accumulate an imprint on your mind that will later then ripen as you being killed, you having health problems, you dying early, taking rebirth in lower realms, taking rebirth in low and scary and bad situations as a human being, etc., etc., etc. So when an action has all four components. The object is there, the motivation intention is there, the effort is there, the completion is there. That's a complete action, forms a complete imprint on the mind, and has the potential to bring about all of the various effects that the imprint of an action can bring about. So yes, killing a spider does accumulate the negative karma of killing, because it includes, I'm assuming, all four of these components in when you kill spiders. Likewise, if you rescue a bee and you're going, well, this bee is very helpful and they're stopping climate change and whatever it is you think when you're saving bees, right? So the bee is the object of the action. The bee is the thing you're acting upon, right? The motivation and intent is to get them out of the house. Maybe the intent is you want to save their life because you think they're good for the environment or something. So the motivation is, I want them to be able to pollinate, and I hear bees are going out of existence. I want to help the bees and this sort of thing, right? Maybe that's what you're thinking. And then there's the effort. So you go get a water glass and a piece of paper, and you're trying to do it so that you don't squish them and all of this, right? So that's the effort, and you think it through, and it's sort of like the opposite of the spider. How do I do this without causing any harm? And then once you have them, you let them go, and you go, yeah, I saved the bee, right? And so that's the completion. You see yourself actually saving the bee's life, and you feel good. So likewise, this forms an imprint on your consciousness according to karmic theory, the theory of actions. And that imprint has the potential to lead to long life, good health, rebirth in the upper realms, rebirth in a high status in the human realms, the compulsion in a future life to save lives, and what else? Being in situations where other people save your life, or other beings or the environment supports your life and saves your life or extends your life. So likewise, same as the killing the spider, but the opposite. And these two don't cancel each other out. So each imprint is just in there doing its thing, waiting for the right conditions to ripen. So in terms of general karmic theory, karma that has been accumulated does not disintegrate or become nothing until it actually ripens and turns into something in your experience. And then once it's ripened into something in your experience, it can be exhausted through the process of occurring as something. You can also do purification practices to get rid of negative karma, and you can do rejoicing to increase your good karmas and good merit and so forth. You can do dedication prayers and practices to seal your good karma so that it can't get damaged in the future or won't get damaged as much. So there are ways to work with karma, but generally speaking, if it's been accumulated, it doesn't go away by itself. Let's just say it that way. Karma also multiplies. So karma is a bit organic in a sense, that sort of like matter, once it's been created. Oh no, that's not a great example. Scratch that. So karma has this factor of multiplication, which you can think about a little bit like a seed, right? If you have an acorn, the acorn, when you plant it, doesn't grow into one single acorn, right? You plant the acorn, and the acorn then sprouts and becomes a huge tree with hundreds of branches, hundreds of leaves, thousands of leaves, tens of thousands over a number of years of new acorns. Likewise, a single action can produce an entire cascade of effects, huge effects that last long periods of time. So karma, they say, multiplies. In addition to this, a lot of times when karma ripens, it occurs in such a way that you will accumulate those same negative karmas again, which really sucks. So, for example, it can be really good, can be really bad. If you get in the habit of killing, then in the future you have the compulsion to kill again, and you'll kill again and accumulate the karma of killing once again. And so this is sometimes like, for example, why they say it's really bad to give your vows back and to break your vows if you've taken vows or you're whatever, because you're accumulating you're not just like giving up the vow or breaking the vow, you're accumulating a karma to have the habit of breaking vows over and over and over and over and over and over again in the future. You see this? So what else? It doesn't dissipate, it multiplies. There's a few other things. But in general, this is the sort of broad strokes of karma. There's half a dozen other topics, but there are a few more questions. Okay. Yeah, Mugao's covering a bit of creationists and materialists. Materialists don't necessarily agree with creationists that material reality has a starting point. Materialists, Buddhists, and creationists all agree that this universe has, roughly speaking, a start, a beginning. The materialists are agnostic about what comes before that beginning. They just say, we don't know. It could be more materialist stuff, could be something else. We don't know. The creationists say there's no more material stuff behind here, there's only God. The Buddhists say that there's the karma and consciousnesses of sentient beings which gives rise to a new universe, but before this there was a previous universe also, and that those previous universes go on infinitely without beginning. So everybody actually agrees this universe has a beginning. What they disagree about is what comes before. Materialists are basically saying we don't know, and Buddhists are saying, based upon the reports of our yogis, causality has no beginning. Karma and the minds of sentient beings give rise to new physical things, like universes. So in between universes, you still have the existence of the minds of sentient beings and their karma. And where did their karma come from? Where did the imprints of previous actions come from? From a time when there was another universe. So there was no first universe where they were accumulating karma. This has been happening infinitely into the past. Which, for the scholars in the room, infinite causal sequences are necessary beings in philosophical terms. An infinite causal sequence is not like the instances of effects or moments in time in the sequence. The moments in time in the sequence are contingent. The sequence as a whole couldn't have failed to exist because it has always existed and doesn't depend upon something outside of itself. Therefore, it's what's called philosophically a necessary being. It's a thing that exists by necessity. And so it doesn't need to come from something else. By nature, it is fully sufficient as an existent thing and can't have an explanation for its existence outside of itself because it never came into being at some time. If it came into being at some time, you would have to explain what did it rely upon to come into being. But it's always been doing what it's doing. It's always been infinitely a sequence of causes and effects. So in the exact same way that creationists would say God exists as a necessary being and therefore doesn't require an explanation. And by the way, half of the Buddhists I talk to think that if you just simply ask a creationist where did God come from, that you win the argument by necessity or by default. This is one of the dumbest arguments against God on the planet. And you will be laughed out of the room at any theological college anywhere if you make that argument. It's a terrible argument. So why Buddhists keep repeating it over and over and over again, I couldn't tell you. A much better argument is there's nothing that you actually have to break all of the laws of logic and reality as we see them, as we understand them, to put that being forward as a cause for the universe. In the case of an infinite causal sequence, we're just saying the ingredients we already have at hand are what create all of this, and there's no first moment of those ingredients. We don't need something that breaks all the rules of reality, something unchanging instead of changing, right? Consciousness, karma, previous material causes, all changing, giving rise to new stuff. Unchanging creator deity, unchanging, and for some reason giving rise to new stuff. That's weird. How can an unchanging thing give rise to new stuff? All of the examples you point to in reality, you never find a first cause. The Big Bang is the point of contention, so we can't point to the Big Bang and say that's a first cause because I don't agree with you. You don't agree with me, Mr. Creationist. You say it's a first event. I say it's not a first event. So we can't use the Big Bang as an example, either one of us. Every other thing in reality that you can point to from the moment of the Big Bang to now came from an effect that was itself caused, and every cause was itself an effect. So every cause is an effect, every effect is a cause. Since things are like that, I just say before the Big Bang, every effect was a cause, every cause was an effect. It's the exact same process that's been happening since the Bang banged, just carries on backwards infinitely. So I don't have to break a single rule of reality as we understand it to put forward my explanation, and I still get to use the argument that an infinite causal sequence is a necessary being, a necessarily existent thing. So I get all of the benefits of the Creator God explanation and none of the downsides. Now I only have to deal with the problem of infinities, but if we're relying on a B theory, an A theory or a B theory, I always get the two confused, of time, and I say, well, there's only one moment, there's the present moment, then we never have the problem of having to wait for the present moment to catch up or wait for the past to catch up with the present an infinite number of times. It's always been the present moment. The present moment has always given rise to the next present moment, and we've always been on the bus of the present moment. We've never stepped off the bus into some other moment. So we've never been waiting an infinite time for anything to happen. It's all been happening in this present moment, which flips over into the next present moment. So there are ways of dealing with the infinity problems too. Okay, once again, not the question you asked, but why not? How is the authority passed down by yogis that cannot be seen with reason and logic, not revelation? Our Buddhai, it is revelatory. The only difference between the Buddhist version of revelation in this sense and the broader, however you'd like to put it, sort of context of, ooh, that was nice. The broader context of revelation is that normally revelation is revelation from on high, from an omniscient or extremely powerful deity down to us lowly beings at their discretion. And you and me, Dr. Jones and our Buddhai, you and I, we don't get to choose if we can verify that or not. If that deity were to grace us with the same experience and information, we could verify it. Otherwise, we can't. In the case of Buddhism, the Buddha said, come and see. Come and see. Come take a look. The Buddha didn't say, I'm a special being and only I get to see this and know this and you need to believe me in that way. Although the Buddha does actually say it's good to have faith in holy beings and the things they say. Despite popular opinion, that is actually what the Buddha taught, even in the Pali Canon. And it's also taught in the Agamas, which is the Zen canon. So it is actually everywhere, despite what people think. So how is authority passed down by yogis that cannot be seen with reason or logic? How is it not a revelation? It's not a revelation in this specific sense. Revelation in Buddhism is great yogis entering meditation, attaining certain knowledge, having methods that lead to that specific kind of knowledge, and those methods are open to you. So if you're willing to put in a master's degree worth of effort and time and energy into training and meditation, a year or two of full-time effort, training and concentration, training and meditation, you too can gain access to this knowledge that is, let's call it the master's degree level of direct insight into the nature of reality. If you don't put in that time and energy and effort, you don't get to have the experience, just like you don't get the degree from the university if you don't put in the time and energy and work. So the Buddha said, come and see, come take a look. I will teach you the method. You do the work. And if you do the method and you do the work and you put in the time, you will also have the experience. And then how do we as outsiders who don't know if that's true or not, how do we decide whether or not it's true? Well, it's not the best evidence if you're being really skeptical about things, but it's okay evidence. It's okay evidence that generation after generation after generation of practitioners, the greats of each generation have said, I went and I did huge amounts of practice like the Buddha recommended. I had these experiences, and it was exactly what the Buddha said. And those sorts of reports carry on right up to today. Watch Yogis of Tibet. You'll see, I think there are 2 yogis who say, yeah, you do your practice, you do a lot of practice, spend time in retreat, and you'll recall all your past lives. Look up Venerable Mahabua Weeps for Us All. Venerable Mahabua, great Theravadan practitioner, in one of the great lines of great Theravadan practitioners, by the way. He's not like some weird outlier doing his own thing. He's part of a sort of cloud, let's say, of the most notable Theravadan practitioners you have heard of as a modern person. He's in this cloud of great beings, had these experiences, and again, for some reason, because most monks don't talk about it if they have them, in one time in his entire life, as far as I know, spoke about it in public and said, yeah, it's exactly like this. So this is the best we can do. We can do the philosophical analysis I did to determine that it is possible, theoretically, that causality goes back infinitely. We can do that. We can do philosophical analysis to determine, yes, there's some probability that the mind is non-physical, based upon things like qualia and based upon things like looking at the mental images that mind produces and how strange those are, which I've done a number of times on this channel. There's a number of ways before you're a great meditator to get at the idea that the mind might be non-physical and therefore shouldn't depend upon the body in order to come into existence, and shouldn't go out of existence when the body goes out of existence. So we have a number of different tools there to say this is something that's possible, and then you just have to do the work. And as you do the work, you gain incremental experience that verifies this stuff. It doesn't just happen all at once. You get a little bit of a taste more and more and more. And the texts on all of this, generally speaking, they describe, you'll go through steps and stages, and you get a little bit of taste along the way. And the little tastes they describe, and the tastes that are described from your community when you're in a living community of practice, it turns out those are the actual things that happen when you do the practices. It's very surprising. It could be the other way, right? It could be that you do all this stuff and nothing happens. But if you do the work, the things they promise actually happen. Same thing, time for a brief commercial break before I jump on to Wojtek's question. So, speaking of doing stuff and having it happen, I teach a package, let's say, of meditative techniques. Hopefully, I don't like to say too much about myself, but we're on the internet and you don't really know who I am. So I've done a fair amount of practice. I've done a fair amount of retreat. I also obviously have a PhD in Buddhist studies and studied a fair amount of the cognitive science of meditation. I took the best stuff I have ever found from great practitioners, living and dead, modern and ancient, who are giving advice to people who want to actually generate meditative accomplishment. And I selected the very best techniques that I have found from direct experience, work to produce actual progress in training and concentration as a person living in the real world. And I put them into a package that I call the 5 Foundations of Meditation. If you go and look at the playlist on YouTube I have for the 5 Foundations, I have a bunch of the material there for how to do those techniques. Also, if you wanted to support what I do, because I do all of this for free, but to keep the lights on, I have to have a certain number of people that are training with me and paying to do that, and a certain amount of donations have to come in. So if you want to donate, go down below the video, just hit pause right now and come right back. Donate whatever you can on the Venmo or the PayPal. Makes a huge difference, because without donations and contributors, I can't do this. This is all I do full time, is help people with their practice, do these live streams, teach the classes, and make content. And I don't have any ads on my content, and I don't do anything promotional. So if the community doesn't think it's valuable enough to provide me with enough to keep the lights on, then at some point I'll have to stop doing it. So far, so good. But if you have the means and the inclination, please do chip in whatever you can. And the best way to do that is through Venmo or PayPal, because they have the lowest fees. Next best way to do it, if you want to train with me full on, more seriously, go to the 5 Foundations course. It's listed in the description below the video. 5 Foundations course includes a whole system for actually training in concentration as a layperson living in the real world. If you also like stuff like yoga and qigong, Chinese internal martial arts like Tai Chi, etc., there's a link below that one for 18 Lohan Palm. And my material, my 5 Foundations materials, baked into that course. So you could train in really, really, really high quality lineage of Chinese internal arts, qigong, neigong, internal martial arts, etc., and also train in my 5 Foundations if you sign up for the 18 Lohan Palm program. And that's another way you could support what I'm doing, although I get a much smaller portion of that course. So if you want to support me more directly, best way is through donation or joining a class. Now, having said that, likewise, I have a number of students, to bring it back to Budai's question now. I have a number of students who have done these techniques, and they tell me the stuff that I tell them will happen. Foundation 1, you're training in concentration with great intensity, great force, and what happens is immediately it shows you how screwed up your mind is, how terrible your focus is, unless you already have some experience. And as you see how terrible your mind is, your mind gets a little calmer, a little clearer. A lot of people have the experience that they don't like how they've behaved in the past. They think they haven't been as ethical as they should have been. That happens. Another thing that happens is it immediately shows you how bad your focus and attention is. And so people notice for the first time, wow, my attention is super out of control. I thought it was really good, and it's actually not good at all. And that's a sign of progress, because you didn't notice before, and now you're noticing. You can do something about it. And so this is one of the signs that's described in the classical texts. First thing that happens when you place your mind on an object and you can hold it there for a short period of time, amongst the first thing that happens is you notice how unbelievably distractible your mind is. Yeah. And like this, there are steps and stages and steps and stages and signs that you're making progress on those steps and stages that are relatively consistent. And if you know what they are, this stuff is all there in the oral tradition or in the written text. It's all there. And most everyone has the same experiences. So come and see is the Buddha's invitation. Come take a look. And when you do the practice, if you find that the earlier parts are as we described, this is an indication to you that the later parts that sound totally like outer space weirdo stuff, it's also going to be like that if you just keep going. Okay. Wojtek, what books on Buddhist philosophy and practice would you recommend? If you go to the Discord, which is also linked below, the Discord server, there's a Buddhist resources page. And on that page, I have vetted a really huge list of really good resources for all sorts of stuff, all sorts of different things. If you want to study Buddhist languages, classical languages, if you want to study the Vinaya if you want to study the sutras, agamas if you want to study whatever. Huge list of digital resources, a whole bunch of other courses by other lineages and teachers that I think are okay. And then in addition to that, I have a short list of books that I think are quite good on Buddhism that are, that have a fair amount of detail. And they're the books that if I were teaching people, that I would probably start with those books in teaching people about Buddhism. Yeah. So, based on your own inclinations, just go to the Discord, check out that list of books. You could read How to Expand Love. You could read one of the Lam Rim texts. You could read the one on Zen. There's a couple on Zen that are quite good. It just depends a bit on your own inclinations and where you lean. But the best thing to do is to study those books while regularly talking with someone who has transmission of that particular teaching. Because the real meaning of the text isn't contained in the words. It's the words plus the oral tradition, which is much bigger, richer, has a vitality to it. So if you're studying and reading those things, you should also regularly be communicating with somebody that has that oral transmission associated with the text, which is not just somebody reading the words to you. It's explaining the whole meaning of the text and what it means in terms of practice and all of this. It's quite important. Okay, neo-imperfection. Please answer this question. The difference between infinite regress and infinite causation. Right. Well, here's the thing. An infinite causal sequence is not a logical fallacy. Right? Now, if I said that A causes B and B causes A, then I've put myself in an infinite causal situation that's impossible, right? It's how to say? It's a situation that is not tenable, I suppose, right? In an abstract logical sense. In an abstract Western logical school setting, if you're setting up a series of arguments and you end up with an infinite series of causes, that's a problem. However, when we're talking about this specific example, the example of a universe coming into existence, this is a unique case, right? But in a sense, the so-called fallacy of infinite logic of infinite regress is only a fallacy if you think that first causes are a necessity. Because if I ask you what causes the tree, you could answer an acorn, or you could answer there's no first cause for a tree. If you're asking exactly what is the genesis of the tree, where does this tree come from in terms of first causes, I would say there's an infinite series of causes. And if you simply say, well, I don't accept that infinite series of causes exist, no problem. I disagree. You have to actually show, you can't simply say that an infinite causal sequence is impossible. You have to actually show that an infinite causal sequence can't work whatsoever. And there isn't actually, I have assessed and addressed the most difficult, potent arguments against infinite stuff, because infinities have all sorts of interesting properties. I have personally digested this material to a great degree and looked at the best arguments against this, and they're not that good. In the video I put up on infinite causal sequences, and I'm going to do another one at some point to address the Kalam cosmological argument. The big one is, for example, to use his analogy, William Lane Craig says that proposing an infinite causal sequence is like asking, how does a frog jump out of a well that has no bottom? And at first, that's catchy. It grabs your mind, and you go, yeah, if there's nothing for it to stand on, how does it jump out of the well? Except, here's the problem. That analogy doesn't relate at all to what we're talking about. Because there is, in the actual case under discussion, there's nothing jumping out of the infinite causal sequence. There's nothing that is at the end trying to get away from, get out of the thing. An infinite causal sequence, in the way it's described in Buddhism, is a presentism. It's a system in which the present moment flips over into a new present moment. The past is gone. The future is as yet unarisen. So there are an infinite number of previous present moments, but at any given time, there's only one event. There's only one present moment. So in the frog analogy, there's no frog that has to jump from the infinite past to land in the present moment. There's no frog of the past moment trying to find something over here stable enough to jump out and land in the present moment. By way of analogy, the frog has always been outside the well. If you want to use that analogy, the frog has always been sitting outside the well, infinitely. The analogy I like to use is, imagine a bus stop. William Lane Craig is saying, if you had to wait for an infinite number of past events to arrive at the present, you would have to wait an infinite period of time for the bus to arrive, wouldn't you? Well, of course. If the bus is taking an infinite amount of time to arrive at the present, to arrive at your bus stop, then it will never arrive, because an infinite period of time never ends. And therefore, the bus will never arrive and never pick you up. And therefore, William Lane Craig would argue, the past could never arrive at the present moment, just like the bus could never arrive at the bus stop. The problem is, that's not our argument. Our argument is, you've always been on the bus. You were always on the bus. From infinite time into the past, you have never not been on the bus. Because the present moment flips over into the next present moment, flips over into the next present moment, flips over into the next present moment, and there's only ever one event. There's never two events, right? So I don't have to deal with the problems that are being put forward through the analogies and this and that and this and that, because that's not the argument that's being made in our system. But even if it was the argument being made in our system, to be clear, I can also come up with arguments that work against that argument. So, for example, if I'm waiting for the bus, and here's the sneaky part, right? You ready? The sneaky part, for example, with the frog jumping out of a well example, is that that's actually not the argument we're making. That's not the argument we're making, once again, that there is a sheer vacuity out of which this present moment needs to arrive, right? That there's an infinite number, the infinite into the past, that the frog needs to start from infinite in the past and jump to the present moment. Why? Because there's no such event called infinite event into the past. If this is the present moment, the previous moment is here. That's a limited distance. That's a limited amount of time. The moment before that is here. That's a limited amount of time. So the frog can jump a limited distance. It can jump from here to here. Can it jump from here to here? Yeah, it can jump from there to there. Can it jump from here to here? Yeah, it could jump from there to there. Could it jump from here? Yeah. So every single moment in the past is the bottom of a well, by way of analogy, that the frog could jump a limited distance from to land in the present moment. By way of, again, to explain a little bit more, every single event in the past is only a finite distance from the present moment, even if every single event in the past amounts to an actual infinite number of events. Let me say that again, a different way. If the number of events in the past is infinite, and we zoom in on any singular event in the past, every single one of them, every single individual event is only a finite distance from the present moment, just like this. There's no event called infinite moment into the past over here. There's only events that are a finite distance from the current event. There's no such event that is an infinite distance from the event. And therefore, even if the past existed in the way that's being described by someone like William Lane Craig, every single moment in an infinite causal sequence only being a finite distance from the present moments means by logical necessity that the past would have to, even with an infinite number of past events, arrive at the present moment. Why? Because none of them are an infinite distance from the present, and given infinite time, every single one of the events on an infinite sequence of past events would arrive at the present moment. And we are proposing infinite time in the past. So therefore, I could, if I wasn't going to die so soon, I could wait at the bus stop and the bus would arrive. So even if it was the worst possible scenario, and there were past events that were actually infinite in number, the bus still gets to the present moment and I can hop on. So like this, the so-called problem of infinite regress in this case, this example does not apply. If it's a presentism, we're just fine as Buddhists. If it's an infinite number of actual events in the past, we're still just fine as Buddhists, and we don't need something outside the system to explain how it got the way that it is. Okay. Xiaoheng Chong says, from UVA studies, we see some examples of human-to-human rebirth. That's true. How can we, through direct realization, know that our mind stream can enter other realms like animals or deities? Okay. Good question. So when you look at University of Virginia studies on, and other studies on near-death experience, if you go on YouTube and listen to people talk about near-death experience, what you'll find is that if you view it all through a Buddhist lens, right, you just sort of look at it through Buddhist glasses, you'll find that people describe heavenly realms. People describe conflicts in the heavenly realms, devas and lesser devas, suras and asuras. Conflict between different beings in the form realm. Beings who still have bodies but are divine or spiritual bodied beings. So we have that in the descriptions of near-death experience. We have descriptions of near-death experience of people wandering around the human realm. We have descriptions in near-death experience of people taking rebirth in what they call hell. But when you look at the descriptions of some of the hellish existences from near-death experience, where people are wandering around for months or years in some type of weird existence, some of those descriptions don't sound like hell from our perspective. They sound like hungry ghost realms. I was wandering around for years without food. I couldn't find anything to drink. My body was skinny and deformed. I encountered all these other weird beings who were skinny and deformed and would beat me up anytime they saw me. Like this. That's a hungry ghost realm. Same thing. If you look for hellish NDE experiences, you'll find things that sound like the hell realms. With, not the full range of the hell realms you find in Buddhism, but a fair amount of the range of stuff you would find in typical Buddhist texts from the Pali Canon on up on the hell realms, including some pretty weird and specific details. I was thinking, for some of my students, I was thinking about putting together a montage of near-death experiences where people described the different realms of existence. They don't describe it as those realms, right? But they describe elements that are included in the traditional Buddhist description of the realms. And I was going to sort of line these up and put the videos there with the actual sources from the Buddhist canon and be like, yeah, that's this, right? Anyways, so yes, there's some differences between what you find in Buddhist literature and what you find in near-death experience. And yes, some people say that they meet Jesus and go to Christian heaven and all of this. Some people say that they see Buddha in the hell realms and all of this. But actually, if you understand Buddhism, all of that makes sense. The Buddha said heavenly realms are real. The Buddha said form beings are real. The Buddha said formless beings are real. I don't think the Buddha would reject the idea that Christian heaven is real. He would reject the idea that it lasts forever and that it's the best place to go. So the Christian heaven is probably a real place. There probably is a being called Jesus. That being probably can, because of your connection with that being, help you get into that heaven. Right? Like, these aren't super problematic from a Buddhist standpoint, based upon what I know. Yeah, but what about people who say they see Buddha in hell? The Tantras say that you might see beings that look like Buddhas in the hells. Why? Because if you do tantric practice wrongly, you can be reborn in the hells looking like a Buddha. So it makes perfect sense from a Buddhist standpoint why you might see some beings that look like Buddhas in the hell realms. So everything that I find in near-death experience seems to match roughly. Again, some wiggle room. It's a little bit more organic than the Buddhist description is pretty crisp. There's some more organic elements there, but broad strokes. It fits. It still fits. So I think this is some evidence that's okay, And then in terms of the rest of it, you can talk to great yogis if you hang around for a while and ask them. You can ask them what, can you tell me from your experience about this or this or that or that? And sometimes they'll tell you, depending on your relationship with them. And then in terms of practice, if you do certain types of practice, you discover, I have heard, that through various types of practice, you can access these realms from direct experience, and you can just see. You can just go take a look for yourself. And according to the Pali, I think it's the Pali, it's just the jhanas. Just through training and concentration, you gain the ability to start looking at the realms. So do your jhana practice, kids. All right. My attraction to Buddhism is because it can be verified through experience. I'm convinced of impermanence, dependent origination, emptiness, things like rebirth. I'm still skeptical. Yeah, that's fine. So Buddhist, totally fine. I spent the first 12 years being really skeptical, even though I didn't want to be. I wanted to sort of be the good Buddhist and accept everything. I just couldn't. It was too weird. It was too weird, too out there. And then I did a lot of practice. I talked to practitioners. I had practitioners do things that defy the laws of physics right in front of my face. Stuff that I thought was mythology turned out to be real stuff because people did it or it happened in my own practice. And that is a big part of how I became convinced that this stuff isn't just mythology. And then also what helped is reading, especially the last 10 years or so, of studies and data on children with past life memories, on near-death experience. The research for that was not so good in the 80s and 90s. It's gotten really good in the last 10 years, 15 years. It's gotten really good. Way, way better. Way better methods, way better controls. And it's compelling stuff for both children with past life memories and near-death experience. And reading that literature and reading the case studies from that literature is really compelling. Also, if you look at philosophy, Western philosophy, did you know that our physics, our modern physics, says you might need consciousness to explain the existence of physical things? That physical things exist as potential occurrences of a physical event, and to explain why they become an actual individual physical event, you need consciousness. And then furthermore, as time has gone on, yes, we have many worlds, we have this, we have that, we have a ton of different explanations for this, but the Copenhagen interpretation, where you need mind with a special status in the collapse of the wave function, special status of consciousness interpretation of quantum mechanics, is still a viable living option according to modern physicists. This is not woo-woo quack people on the internet. These are people that hold positions at the best universities in the world. Some of them have Nobel Prizes, some of them are chairs of departments, and they say you need consciousness to explain the existence of physical stuff. Physical stuff doesn't make sense unless we also talk about consciousness. What kind of consciousness? Something non-local. In other words, it's not just in your head. And depending on who you ask, could have a few other weird properties, like stretching out across time. That's weird. Anyways, so even in our own culture as modern skeptical people, there are extremely competent people in our culture. There are also philosophers like David Chalmers, and there are philosophical introspective experiments you can do, like the one that I have on my page somewhere, if you go look for it, where you look at the contents of consciousness. Something like an apple, a visualized apple, for example, I have an example of that somewhere. I think it's just, is consciousness non-physical, I think is the name of the video with a question mark. If you do an experiment, you actually look at what mental images are. They're extremely strange from a physicalist perspective. I mean, like unbelievably strange. So this can give you a sense that, well, okay, if these images are so strange, the thing generating the images must also be pretty strange in the same way, if not stranger. And so you can do experiments to look and see, well, okay, if it looks like consciousness isn't physical, if it looks like you need consciousness to explain the existence of physical things, if it looks like children have memories from past lives, if it looks like the mind leaves the body, if the heart stops or the heart muscles removed from the body for periods of time in surgery, that 1 out of 4 people or 1 out of 7 people have their mind literally leave their body, and some of them bring back information we can verify. Right? All of that would be much better explained by a mind that isn't purely dependent upon the physical body. A mind that is non-physical and can travel from lifetime to lifetime, etc., is a better explanatory model for a bigger, wider range of stuff in our current intellectual life, even as skeptical people. The other explanation doesn't account for huge amounts of stuff we have discovered about the world, in my opinion. So at least I would just say we have fairly good evidence at this time to think the mind is non-physical, probably doesn't end at death, probably doesn't begin at birth. Pretty good evidence for this. And in between, we have philosophical experience and physics to bolster the idea, and meditation training to bolster the idea that consciousness is probably non-physical. This is something you can experience for yourself. By the way, I teach this in the 5 foundations. Foundation 4, Mahamudra style practice, you learn how to actually touch consciousness so that you can look at it. That's part of the purpose of those practices. Okay. Jay, welcome, if you're still here. Neo Imperfection says, thank you for your explanation. From my personal experience, past and future are like a mathematical limit approaching the origin point of a graph. The present moment is the origin point. Yeah, I think if I'm understanding you, that's similar to the Buddhist view, or the same as the Buddhist view. The Buddhist view is that you have the present moment, and the previous moment, the immediate previous moment, gave rise to this moment. Like I said with the pen, the past moment flips over and becomes the present moment, which flips over and becomes the next moment. So there is no actually existent past thing. There's only the present. And the reason the future doesn't exist yet is because the present is going to flip over and become the next present moment, i.e. the future. So when this pen flips over again, it will be the present, not the future. The future is just the whatever possibilities there are in terms of the way in which this pen can flip over again, right? So when a Buddha, for example, sees the future and predicts your eventual enlightenment, the Buddha is looking at the momentum of the pen, so to speak, and going, yep, when it gets here, there's no chance it's going to stop. It's going to carry on and go here. No other choice because of the momentum of the object at this point. Likewise, the Buddha looks at the momentum of your merit, your karma, etc. And for you as a being, you're now headed in a particular way. So nonetheless, the present is the only thing that's there, even though the potential for the next future moment is in the present. And therefore, for a clairvoyant being like a Buddha or a greatly realized meditator, some of that information is available right here and now. Okay, I digress once again. Xiaoheng, quite welcome. Not a huge fan of William Lane Craig. I do see your Yep. Mathematical possibilities of infinities of different sizes. Yeah, I agree. The math on that's pretty interesting, even though I'm not a great mathematician. Okay. Xiaoheng. People around me do say I'm using a Buddhist lens to explain things when they do not subscribe to the same beliefs. Is this something you see as a problem, or should we be more neutral? I mean, if you're a serious practitioner, it can be useful to be able to, at times, set aside your view and to just look at something as fresh and unbiased as you can. That's a useful skill. However, from day to day, decision to decision, moment to moment, as a practitioner, you need to be able to actually live based upon the stuff you believe and the stuff you've experienced. If you don't have enough force in your worldview to drive your behavior, then your worldview is not mature enough, right? So if your worldview is not mature enough to drive your behavior, to drive how you think, to drive how you talk, to drive how you do stuff with your body, then your worldview is sort of like, it's just ideas. It doesn't have any power. See what I mean? So when your worldview has enough power to drive your thinking, to drive your emotions, to drive your speech, to drive your body, that will be noticeable to other people. But you should have the skill as a human being to know when it's appropriate to apply your worldview to a situation and to, how to say, sort of not apply it in the public sphere when it's not appropriate. I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that helps too much. You have to gain some skill in talking to people, if I'm going to bring it back down to the level. You just have to gain some skill in talking to people so that the stuff you say is helpful. One of my teachers used to say, you used to reek of delusions, now you reek of Zen. You used to reek of delusions, now you reek of Zen. You have to have the ability to talk to people at whatever level they're at. When I teach meditation, for example, most of the time I try to teach it from a secular aspect, because the Buddha taught us that meditation is a human thing that humans can do if they want. And so I teach meditation to Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, Sikhs, Hindus, whoever you are. I'm happy to teach you meditation as long as you want to do it and you're going to be a bit serious about it, serious enough that you can actually make some progress. Otherwise, you're wasting your time and probably my time, Not good for either of us. Like the first practice that I teach is 5 minutes. So if you can't commit to 5 minutes most of the time, then we need to take a step back and work on the worldview so that your worldview has enough power and force to drive your behavior to do at least 5 minutes of practice a day, right? Because there's something not right with your motivation if you can't get yourself to do 5 minutes of something, right? You just don't think it's important. So we got to change the attitude so that you think it's important. Anyways, so like this, if you want to help other people, you have to have a set of tools and ways of talking that address a whole bunch of different audiences. This is why it's much more difficult to teach than it is to just do it. If you're just trying to do it, whatever you do for you that gets you going and gets you moving and all of this, and whatever parts of the teaching sort of get you headed the right way, is sort of like, that's good enough, But if you want to help other people, you have to have a much wider basket of skills and abilities, and not easy. Okay. Austin says, is consciousness independent of the brain? I think I discussed that a bit. I would say that from a classical standpoint, as best I can discern, the brain the brain has a relationship with consciousness, and there's an intermediary between these two. So the body and the mind and the body have an intermediary, which is, how to say, what we might call prana, kundalini, chi, shen. The Tibetans call it wind, long, long. So there's an intermediary between physical stuff and mental stuff. And the subtlest unit, the smallest unit of reality is, to use the pen again as an example, is consciousness with the subtlest physical substance as a single unit, as a single package. This is the smallest unit of reality. And so the subtlest unit of reality has the potential to interact with both conscious stuff and physical stuff. And at our level of experience, this is manifested, you could say, as physical and mental stuff being intermediated by the subtler types of physical substances. Maybe that helps. Maybe it doesn't. I'm starting to get some lag, so if it's getting a little bit laggy, you can pause and then let it buffer and come back, or you can go back a bit. But when it actually gets uploaded, if this is too boring, you can come back after it's all uploaded, and then the lag will go away. It'll be normal. Can the middle path be a general philosophical one uses about things? The middle path is only relevant to certain stuff, because there's no amount of killing out of hatred, for example, that is the middle. Like, well, I'm only going to kill a little bit out of hatred. I'm only going to take a little bit of heroin. Just, middle path. So there's no amount of certain things that is part of the middle for Buddhism. Middle, if we're using it in the sense that it was used for the renunciate life, the middle is, don't be decadent. Don't live a super decadent life. If you want to be a renunciate, right? If you want to be a monk or a nun, a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni, don't live a lavish lifestyle, and don't live a lifestyle that is so disconnected from your physical needs that you stop being able to do the work of training your mind in Buddhist stuff. So you need to have a middle ground between decadence, overindulgence, and not providing your body and so forth, or your not having enough in terms of your living environment, that you like you're getting distracted because you're tired from not eating and you have hunger pangs and blah 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 blah, right? So that's a middle way. Another middle way is the Buddha teaches dependent origination. So the Buddha doesn't teach things don't exist, and the Buddha doesn't teach things exist in and of themselves. The Buddha says things exist dependently. So over here is things don't exist at all. Over here is things exist through their own nature. And the Buddha teaches neither one of those. A middle path where things still exist, but they exist in a way that is totally different than these two options. That's a middle path, middle way. So when we're talking about ontology, that's what we mean. The middle way between those two extremes. Those are as far as I know, those are the only two ways in Buddhist thought and practice that the middle way is used. So it's not used in a more general sense to mean, oh, well, you just balance the good and bad stuff in your life or something, or like, well, I eat organic, but I get really drunk on weekends. So it's the middle way, because half the time I'm really healthy and the other half the time I'm shit-faced and don't know what's going on. So I'm, middle way. Like, no, that's not it. Xiao Heng Chong, pardon me. Do you know what happened? Wait, do you happen to know why the Buddha's hair looks round like that and not flowy like ours? Yeah, so the earliest depictions of the Buddha that we have round curled hair. And I think the descriptions of the Buddha that we have from the earliest sources say that he had tightly curled hair. And so he has these tightly curled sections of hair on his head. So that would be why he has hair looking the way that it does. And then he has an ushnisha, which can be interpreted a number of ways. So a crown protrusion is this area in the back of his head here, which is higher than the rest. And some of the early sources depict that as basically like a bun, kind of, on the back of his head, according to some scholars, that it was like his hair that he had put up in a bun. But if you look at those early depictions, at least from what I've seen, from Gandhara, for example, actually, there's just sort of a round ushnisha on the back of the head, and then the same curled hairs are all over it. So it's not depicted as like a bun of hair or something, like you might see, not like a man bun, you know? So honestly, what I think is that at least the best descriptions and depictions that we have of the Buddha, because I don't know that we know for sure. We probably don't know for sure, but is that he had very tightly curled hair, and so that's what's depicted on a lot of the statues. And then he had an ushnisha, which is this sort of on his crown, in the back third of his skull. He had this protrusion there. But very interesting, by the way. That area there is if you were doing certain kinds of tantric practices and so forth, this is one of the really important areas for those practices. Just for those who are taking notes about the esoteric stuff in the Theravada that's sort of hidden here and there. Silk Spear asks, do I believe in Buddhism? I do, wholeheartedly. Silk Spear, am I a dualist or a panpsychist? Neither one. So dualism, for those who don't know, means that you believe that there are two radically different substances making up reality: physical substance and mental substance. The problem with substance dualists is that there's no way for the two to interact. I think Buddhism puts forward a neutral monist position. In other words, that the subtlest unit of reality has a mental component and a physical component as one unit. A monism, one mono, right? One thing. It's a neutral monism, meaning that the physical component, neither the physical component nor mental component is primary over the other one, that these two are neutral in the sense that they both come together as one unit, one package, okay? So since this is the subtlest unit of reality, this is something that is capable of, at a more complex level of reality, up here, where it looks like physical stuff and mental stuff are totally different substances. Actually, they're mediated by a subtler unit of reality, i.e., what we would call clear light consciousness, et cetera, that is able to traverse the two. Furthermore, there are these substances that come along with consciousness that are alternatively called prana, wind, chi, et cetera, shun, that mediate the relationship between body and mind, or physical and mental, at this level of our experience. As a side note, if you're interested in those sorts of weirdo things and want to know whether or not they are real things, which much to my, even though I'm quite skeptical of them and I think 99% of that stuff is nonsense, I have been convinced by people that are quite competent in those practices that those are real things. And if you'd like to train in those things, it's part of the 18 Lohan Palm curriculum. So 18 Lohan Palm curriculum, to do a quick commercial break on that, if you don't mind, includes working with your body, then working with the energy body, and then working with the mind. So it has all three of these layers, and you're learning how to point all of them in the same direction. Buddhism is not panpsychist. Panpsychism means that all physical things have like a basic nugget of consciousness or something inside or about them, associated with them. Consciousness is like this one thing that spreads out everywhere, sort of like space-time is spreading out everywhere, and energy and matter and time and blah, blah, blah. It's all tied in together. It's not, no. Buddhism doesn't have anything like that at all. So, no. Definitely not. Buddhism is not a panpsychist position. It's just saying that the subtlest unit of what's making up you as an individual is a unity of subtle physical substance and the subtlest type of consciousness. Right. Okay, my friends. Well, we have reached the bottom of the question and answer chat. So, thank you so much for being here. Very glad to have you all. It's a really good session. We're just about at 3 hours. And let's see. The line between right and wrong is blurry. Okay, that'll be the last one then. From a Buddhist standpoint, the line between right and wrong is not blurry. It's quite clear. As practitioners, sometimes it's blurry. But in terms of the actual mechanisms of action, karma, it's very clear. There are cases where things will produce good results. There are cases where things will produce bad results. And there are cases where, because you have mixed together the components of good and bad stuff, it will produce mixed results. Right? So it's a very clear system. Oh, lots of questions flying in. Cromer says they watched Mahabuddha's talk and it was awesome. Yeah, Venerable Mahabuddha's talk on this it's so inspiring to hear great practitioners talk about their actual experience, because it's very rare that they'll go that deep in public. Is it possible to evaluate near-death experience without a Buddhist lens? Yeah, most of the stuff you read on near-death experience doesn't use a Buddhist lens. The most common are sort of a secular scientific lens, from the point of view of either secular psychology or sort of psychology that's not taking a materialist lens, let's say that. The other most common is a Christian lens. A lot of Christians like near-death stuff because people see Jesus. Yes, so neo-imperfection, if you go below the video here, most of my videos, I have a link to our Discord, Facebook, my school course, and 18 Lohan Palm. If you are a Vajrayana practitioner and you want something physical, I've had really great practitioners, multiple ones, tell me that the Chinese internal arts extremely helpful and beneficial for your Vajrayana practice. Extremely beneficial, because they're working with the same stuff from another angle. And I've even had one person who completed extremely difficult retreat as a Vajrayana practitioner. I won't mention who, because he didn't say that I could talk about that in public, but he said he thinks the Chinese versions for preparing your body and some of aspects of this are better than the Tibetan ones. So quite good. Highly recommend 18 Lohan Palm. Really beneficial. Really, really beneficial. Makes your body comfortable for sitting. And then you work with the energy system like you do in Tantra. And then you work with the subtlest aspects of the energy system like you do in Tantra. But none of it requires empowerment. And then there's a much wider range of techniques because it wasn't secret. And so more techniques developed to give you more tools to work with this stuff to make it work even better. Right? Quite powerful. Very, very powerful. Okay. Right, my friends. Well, we are wrapping up. So please do, if you have it in your heart to contribute, please do below the video. Yeah, muscle tendon changing, bone marrow washing, Qigong, Neigong, really powerful stuff. If you have it in your heart to contribute whenever you can, Venmo or PayPal. we're entering the last week of this month pretty quickly here, the last third of the month. Whenever you can chip in would be great because we're still a little bit short for the month. Still need to build up a bit more community before before I won't need to do this sort of thing during all the lives. If you want to jump into the course and train with me more seriously, definitely check out the 5 Foundations course linked below this video. The 5 Foundations are meant to help you train as a person in real life. It's designed to support your Qigong, Neigong practice. It's designed to support your yoga practice. It's designed to support your spiritual practice in general. It's designed to support your tantric practice. Whatever system you're training in, your Theravadan practice, your Goenka practice, it's meant to help you do it all even better, even more profoundly, even more of the time. That's why I designed it. I've trained with a lot of lay people, gotten the advice so that I can train more seriously as a lay person in the real world, and I'm giving it to you. Also, if you join the school course in particular, once I have 100 people on that school course, we're going to start sponsoring people to go into retreat for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month at a time. Really, really, really cool project. So the people that are training with me seriously through the school course will become eligible in the course of time to be sponsored by the community that I'm building through there to do 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month of retreat. And if it costs you $1,000 to go into retreat, well, if there's 100 of us, that's $10 each, right? So we can probably send 2 or 3, maybe 4 sometimes people into retreat every month once we have 100 people or more in the school course, and we've built that community up together. So if you want to support what I'm doing and have access to that potentially, join the school course. It's a great way to support what I'm doing from month to month. If you want to train in Qigong, Neigong, internal Chinese martial arts, etc., and support what I'm doing, join the 18 Lohan Palm course, which is down below. If you just want to chip in some money because you think this is cool and you'd like it to go on, PayPal, Venmo is down below. And other than that, yeah, I'm having a really, really good time hanging out with all of you. I really love the community, and I'd really like to continue doing this with all of you. So please do chip in with you can, support how you can so that this can go on. I would love to keep doing it. If I can hit the right numbers in the next year or so, then this can all go on forever until I expire. So if you're getting something out of this, chip in what you can, help what you can. And if you can't, don't worry about it, because somebody else will be able to do it this month or this year. And then maybe they fall on hard times and somebody else will fill in, and that person will do it for that month or that year. And this way, the whole community gets the benefit of whoever is able to help at whatever time. So don't feel bad if you can't chip in anything. I'm happy to help for free. That's why I'm here. I want to benefit as many people for free as I can. And if the community thinks it's valuable and chips in, then I can carry on with this indefinitely. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with me as I do the unbearably terrible commercials. And I hope to see you again very soon. Try not to